Crossroads Collector. The moment Joaquin Martinez saw the hitchhiker standing at the crossroads, he knew he should keep driving. It was nearly midnight. The desert road between Chihuahua and Ciudad Juarez was notorious for its dangers, and he was already running late for his delivery. But something about the lone figure, a woman in a white dress, her arm extended in the universal gesture of someone seeking a ride, made his foot ease off the accelerator. "Don't stop," Joaquin told himself, even as his 18-wheeler began to slow. "Not here, not at midnight, not at La Cruz del Diablo, the Devil's Crossroads." That's what local truckers call this isolated intersection where Highway 45 met a smaller road that wound eastward toward the mountains. The name wasn't just colorful trucker slang. It had history behind it, stories dating back to the Spanish colonial era of travelers who disappeared, of bargains struck under moonlight, of fortunes gained and souls lost. Joaquin wasn't a superstitious man at 42, with 20 years of long-haul driving behind him. He considered himself too practical for such nonsense. But neither was he reckless. He'd heard too many reports of highway robberies, of criminals using stranded women as bait to risk stopping for a stranger in such a remote location. Yet, his truck continued to slow as if making its own decision, the air brakes hissing as it finally came to a full stop about 20 meters from the crossroads. The woman hadn't moved. She stood perfectly still beneath the crossroads' only light, an old-fashioned street lamp that cast a sickly yellow glow, creating a perfect circle of illumination in the otherwise absolute darkness. From this distance, Joaquin could see her more clearly. She was young, perhaps in her 20s, with long black hair that hung straight down her back. Her white dress was simple but elegant, unsuitable for the cool desert night or for hitchhiking along a dangerous highway. Most strikingly, she carried nothing, no bag, no jacket, nothing to suggest she was a traveler who had found herself stranded. Joaquin's hand hovered over the door lock. Every instinct told him to drive on, to pretend he'd never seen her. But an equally powerful sense of obligation pulled at him. He'd been raised to help those in need, and whatever her story, this woman clearly needed assistance. With a reluctant sigh, he lowered his window halfway enough to speak, not enough for anyone to reach inside, and called out in Spanish, "Señorita, are you in trouble? Do you need help?" The woman turned toward him slowly, her face still partially shadowed despite the overhead light. "I need a ride," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the night air. "Will you take me to the other side?" Something in her phrasing struck Joaquin as odd. Not, "Can you give me a ride to the next town?" or "I need to get to Juarez," the other side. As if the crossroads marked some boundary more significant than a simple intersection of highways. "Where are you trying to go?" he asked, caution making his tone more brusque than he intended. The woman stepped forward, moving to the edge of the circle of light. Now he could see her face, young and beautiful, with high cheekbones and eyes so dark they seemed to absorb the lamplight rather than reflect it. "I've been waiting a long time for someone to help me cross," she said, ignoring his question. "Others have passed, but none have stopped. You have a kind heart, Joaquin Martinez." Joaquin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. He had not introduced himself, had no name badge visible from outside the truck. "How do you know my name?" he demanded, his finger moving to the window control, ready to close it completely. She smiled, the expression transforming her face in a way that made Joaquin's breath catch. Not because it enhanced her beauty, but because something about that smile seemed wrong, too wide, too knowing, as if her face were a mask being stretched beyond its natural limits. "I know the names of all who pass through my crossroads," she said. "Just as I know why you drive these lonely roads at night instead of sleeping beside your wife. The money you carry in your left boot, the rosary hanging from your mirror that you no longer pray with, the promises you've broken." Joaquin's blood turned to ice. No one knew about the money, 50,000 pesos, he'd skimmed from his deliveries over the past year, saving for a fresh start away from his mounting gambling debts. No one knew he'd stopped praying after his daughter's death 3 years ago, though he kept Anna's rosary as a reminder of his failure to protect her. "Who are you?" he whispered, though part of him already suspected the answer, a suspicion too terrible to acknowledge. "Some call me la coleccionista," she said, her smile unwavering. "The collector. I gather what is owed at the crossroads of decision." "I owe you nothing," Joaquin said, finding his voice again. "I've never seen you before in my life." "Haven't you?" The woman's head tilted slightly. "Look closer, Joaquin. We've met before, though you may not remember. 12 years ago on this very road." Joaquin's mind raced back. 12 years ago. He had been a newer driver then, still learning the routes. There had been an accident, a young woman walking along the highway at night. He'd swerved to avoid her, but in the confusion, he'd never been sure if he'd struck her or not. He'd been drinking, had panicked and driven on without stopping to check. The guilt had haunted him for months afterward, but when no body was reported found, when no family came forward seeking answers, he'd gradually convinced himself that she had survived, or that perhaps she had never existed at all, just a trick of light and shadow combined with his intoxicated state. "That's not possible," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" The woman stepped fully into the light now, and as she did, her appearance changed. The elegant white dress became torn and bloodied. Her face, previously flawless, revealed a massive trauma on one side, as if it had been crushed in an impact. One arm hung at an unnatural angle. "You left me dying in the dust, Joaquin Martinez. You didn't even slow down." Joaquin recoiled, his back pressing against the driver's seat. This couldn't be happening. The woman he might have hit would be in her 30s now, not the youthful figure before him. And no one could have survived injuries like those she now displayed. "You're not real," he said hoarsely. "You're a hallucination. I've been driving too long, I'm seeing things." "I'm as real as your guilt," she replied, her broken form gliding closer to the truck. "As real as your fear, as real as the debt you've carried all these years, a debt that's finally come due." She was at his door now, her ruined face level with his window. Up close, Joaquin could see that her injuries were even worse than they had first appeared. The crushed side of her face revealed bone beneath torn flesh. The eye on that side was missing entirely the socket, a dark, empty hole. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "What all collectors want," she said. "Payment of what is owed. You took something from me 12 years ago, Joaquin, my life, my future, all the days I should have had." Her undamaged hand rose to rest against the window glass, the fingers leaving smears that looked black in the dim light. "Now I've come to collect something in return." "I can pay," Joaquin said desperately, thinking of the money in his boot. "I have cash. I can give you—" "I don't want your money." La coleccionista interrupted, her voice hardening. "What use is currency to the dead? No, what I require is more substantial. My life." Joaquin whispered, genuine terror gripping him now. "You want to kill me?" She laughed, a sound like wind through dry grass. "If I wanted that, you'd already be dead. Death is too simple, too quick. No, Joaquin, what I collect are choices, possibilities, crossroads." Before he could ask what she meant, La coleccionista's hand pressed harder against the window. To Joaquin's horror, the glass began to ripple like water, allowing her fingers to pass through as if the solid barrier were merely an illusion. Her icy hand gripped his arm with surprising strength. "Look," she commanded, her voice now directly in his ear despite the window separating them. "Look and choose." The world around Joaquin seemed to dissolve. The truck, the crossroads, the desert night all faded away, replaced by a series of vivid images that flashed through his mind like film clips. He saw himself at home with his wife Maria, their relationship healed, the gambling debts somehow resolved. He saw himself coaching his nephew's soccer team, finding joy again after years of grief. He saw a version of his life where he had stopped that night 12 years ago, where he had called for help, where the young woman had survived her injuries. Then the visions shifted, darkened. He saw himself driving away from this encounter, continuing his delivery, skimming more money from his employer. He saw the inevitable discovery of his theft, the arrest, the imprisonment. He saw Maria alone, finally divorcing him after years of neglect. He saw his own slow decline ending in a prison cell or a pauper's grave with no one to mourn him. "These are your paths," La Coleccionista whispered, her cold breath against his cheek. "The crossroads you face tonight. One leads to redemption, though the road is hard. The other leads to ruin, though it seems easier at first. I've shown you both. Now you must choose." The visions faded, and Joaquin found himself back in his truck, gasping as if he'd been underwater. La Coleccionista stood outside his window once more, her hand withdrawn, her form again, whole and beautiful, rather than broken and bloody. "I don't understand," Joaquin said, his mind still reeling. "If you're here for vengeance, why show me a path to a better life? Why offer me redemption?" "Vengeance is small," she replied. "Collection is eternal. For each soul who passes my crossroads, I gather their most important choice, the moment they could have changed everything. Some I punish by denying them that choice. Others, like you, I punish by forcing them to make it with full knowledge of the consequences." "And if I choose the right path?" Joaquin asked. "The harder one?" "Then you live with that choice and all it demands of you," she said. "You turn yourself in for the theft. You make amends to your wife. You face the ghost of your guilt both for me and for your daughter, whose death you still blame yourself for. You rebuild piece by painful piece." "And if I choose the other path?" La Coleccionista's smile returned, terrible in its beauty. "Then you drive away from here unchanged. You continue as you have been. And when your life reaches its inevitable lonely end, I'll be waiting at that final crossroads to collect what remains of your soul." Joaquin sat in silence, the weight of the choice before him pressing down like a physical presence. The easier path beckoned to drive away, forget this encounter, as a strange dream or hallucination, continue his plans to escape his debts and start fresh with the stolen money. But he had seen where that road led, the ruin waiting at its end. "How do I know this is real?" he asked finally. "How do I know you're not just a figment of my guilty conscience?" In answer, La Coleccionista reached through the window again, the glass rippling around her arm as before, and placed her hand over his heart. The cold of her touch penetrated his shirt, his skin reaching deep inside him to grip something essential. "Do you feel that Joaquin Martinez?" she asked, her voice soft but implacable. "That is the part of you I've already collected, the part you left behind 12 years ago when you drove away from a dying woman. The part that has been waiting here at this crossroads for you to return and make your choice." She withdrew her hand, and Joaquin gasped as warmth flooded back into his chest, though something still felt missing, as if she had taken a small piece of him with her. "I'll be watching," she said, stepping back from the truck. "You have until dawn to decide your path. By sunrise, your choice will be made one way or another." She began walking backward toward the center of the crossroads. "Choose wisely, Joaquin. Some debts once paid release you. Others chain you forever." As she reached the exact center of the intersection directly beneath the yellow lamp, she seemed to waver like a mirage in the desert heat. For a moment, Joaquin saw her as both entities simultaneously, the beautiful woman in white and the broken victim of a hit and run, before she vanished entirely, leaving the crossroads empty and still. Joaquin sat frozen in his truck, the engine idling, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. His rational mind scrambled for explanations, exhaustion, stress, perhaps even some gas leak in the cabin causing hallucinations. But the cold spot over his heart where she had touched him remained, as did the vivid memory of the two futures he had witnessed. He reached for his phone with trembling hands, intending to call Maria, though he had no idea what he would say. As the screen lit up, he noticed something that made his blood run cold again. The date displayed was April 17th, exactly 12 years to the day since the accident he'd never reported. That coincidence, more than anything else that had happened at the crossroads, convinced Joaquin that his encounter with La Coleccionista had been real. This was his crossroads, his moment of choice, just as she had said. By dawn, he would either be on the path to redemption or the road to ruin. With sudden clarity, Joaquin knew what he had to do. He put the truck in gear and drove through the intersection, leaving La Cruz del Diablo behind. But instead of continuing north toward his delivery destination, he turned the heavy vehicle around and headed south back toward Chihuahua. His first stop would be the police station, where he would confess to both the hit and run from 12 years ago and the money he had stolen from his employer. His second would be home, where he would tell Maria everything: the gambling, the theft, the plans to run away, and now this supernatural encounter that had forced him to confront the man he had become. The road ahead would be difficult, just as La Coleccionista had shown him. There would be legal consequences, financial hardship, and the painful process of rebuilding trust with his wife if she chose to stand by him at all. But for the first time in years, Joaquin felt something like hope, a fragile, tentative feeling that he was finally on the right path. As he drove away from the crossroads, he glanced in his rearview mirror. For just an instant, he thought he saw a figure in white standing in the middle of the road, watching him depart. Then he rounded a curve, and both the crossroads and its mysterious collector disappeared from view. Dawn was breaking when Joaquin reached Chihuahua, the eastern sky lightening from black to deep blue. As he pulled into the parking lot of the police station, he felt a strange sensation in his chest, a warmth spreading outward from the cold spot La Coleccionista's touch had left. The feeling intensified as he switched off the engine and reached for the door handle, becoming almost uncomfortable by the time his feet touched the pavement. He paused, one hand pressed to his sternum, and in that moment of stillness, he heard, or perhaps felt, a whisper that seemed to come from both everywhere and nowhere. Choice made, debt collected. The cold spot in his chest vanished, completely replaced by an unfamiliar lightness, as if something that had been weighing him down for years had finally been lifted. Joaquin took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and walked into the police station to face the consequences of his past and the promise of his future. In the months that followed, Joaquin's life unfolded much as La Coleccionista had shown him. There were charges for the theft, though his voluntary confession and cooperation reduced the severity of his sentence. There were painful conversations with Maria, who was hurt and angry, but ultimately chose to work on their marriage rather than end it. There was the slow, difficult process of rebuilding trust, making amends and finding a way forward from the wreckage of his mistakes. Through it all, Joaquin was sustained by the memory of his encounter at the crossroads and the glimpse he had been given of where his choices could lead. On the darkest days, when the consequences of his actions seemed overwhelming, he would remind himself of the alternative, the lonely, ruinous end that awaited him if he had chosen the easier path. 1 year to the day after his meeting with La Coleccionista, Joaquin found himself driving along Highway 45 again. His legal troubles weren't fully resolved, but he had been allowed to return to work under certain conditions. As his route took him near the infamous crossroads, he felt a pull to return there to see if any trace of his supernatural encounter remained. The crossroads looked ordinary in daylight, just a simple intersection where a main highway met a lesser road, the old lamppost unremarkable without its halo of yellow light cutting through the darkness. Joaquin pulled over and stepped out of his truck, not entirely sure what he was looking for. As he stood at the exact spot where La Coleccionista had appeared to him, something caught his eye, a small memorial marker he hadn't noticed before, the kind often placed at sites of fatal accidents. It was weathered and faded, suggesting it had been there for many years. Joaquin approached it with a sense of foreboding. The inscription was still legible, though barely, in memory of Isabel Diaz, 1981 to 2011. May she find peace at her final crossroads. 2011, 12 years ago, the same year as his accident. As Joaquin stared at the marker, trying to process its significance, a voice spoke from behind him. She was my sister. He turned to find an older woman watching him, her car parked behind his truck. She was perhaps in her 50s, her face lined with grief. The time had softened, but not erased. I come here every year on the anniversary, the woman continued. Isabel was walking home when she was hit. The driver never stopped, never came forward. Joaquin felt dizzy, his heart pounding in his chest. This was real historical proof that his encounter with La Coleccionista hadn't been a hallucination or a dream. Isabel Diaz had been a real person with a real family who mourned her still. I'm sorry for your loss, he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. The woman studied him curiously. You look familiar. Have we met before? Joaquin hesitated on the edge of his own personal crossroads. He had confessed to the police about a hit and run, but without specific details about the victim. The case had never been connected to Isabel Diaz's death. He could walk away now, return to his truck drive on, without revealing his identity to this grieving sister. But that would be choosing the easier path again, exactly what he had promised himself he would no longer do. We haven't met, he said quietly. But I think I'm the person you've been waiting for. He took a deep breath. I'm the driver who hit Isabel that night. I'm the one who didn't stop. The woman's expression cycled through shock, disbelief, and then a slow dawning anger. You, she whispered, after all these years, you're the one. Yes, Joaquin acknowledged, bracing himself for her rage, her accusations, perhaps even physical assault. He deserved whatever reaction came. Instead, after a long moment of tense silence, the woman asked a single question. Why didn't you stop? I was afraid, Joaquin answered honestly. I'd been drinking. I was worried about losing my job, going to jail. I told myself maybe she was okay, maybe I hadn't hit her at all. He shook his head. There's no excuse, not really, I just chose wrong. The woman absorbed this, her gaze never leaving his face. And now, why come forward after all this time? How could he explain about La Coleccionista, about the supernatural encounter that had forced him to confront his past? She would think him mad, or worse, that he was mocking her grief with fantastic stories. Let's just say I finally found my conscience, he said. I've already confessed to the police, but they never made the connection to your sister. I am prepared to make a formal statement to accept whatever consequences come. The woman was silent for so long that Joaquin began to worry she was in shock. Finally she spoke, her voice steady but thick with emotion. Isabel always believed that people could change, that even the worst mistakes could be forgiven if there was true remorse. She wiped at her eyes. I never shared her faith in human nature, but perhaps she was right. I don't expect forgiveness, Joaquin said quickly. I don't deserve it. Forgiveness isn't about deserving, the woman replied. Isabel would say it's about healing for both parties. She straightened her shoulders. I've been angry for 12 years, Mr. Martinez. Joaquin Martinez. Mr. Martinez. I've been angry for 12 years and it hasn't brought my sister back. Maybe it's time to try something else. She extended her hand. My name is Carolina Diaz. I think we have a lot to talk about. Joaquin took her hand, marveling at this unexpected turn. As they shook, he felt a familiar sensation, a brief, impossible cold that flashed through his palm where it touched hers. Carolina showed no sign of feeling it, but Joaquin knew instantly what it meant. La Coleccionista was still watching, still collecting at this crossroads of human connection, human choice. In the years that followed, Joaquin maintained contact with Carolina Diaz, eventually meeting her entire family. There were difficult conversations, tears and recriminations, but also gradually a kind of peace. The formal legal process connected to Isabel's death was painful but cathartic, bringing closure to both Joaquin and the Diaz family. His marriage to Maria grew stronger through their shared challenges. After completing his reduced sentence for the theft, Joaquin found work with a different company, one willing to give him a second chance. He volunteered with organizations promoting highway safety and spoke to driver education classes about the consequences of leaving the scene of an accident. In all those years, Joaquin never again encountered La Coleccionista in her supernatural form. But sometimes when driving remote highways at night, he would feel a cold spot form briefly over his heart, or glimpse a white-clad figure standing at a distant intersection. These moments never lasted longer than a blink, gone so quickly he might have imagined them. But Joaquin knew better. The collector was still out there, still waiting at her crossroads, still gathering the moments of choice that defined human existence. Not all who encountered her would be offered the chance. He had been given the chance to see both paths clearly before making their decision. Some she punished, some she tested, some she merely observed. But all who passed through her domain left something of themselves behind, a small piece collected for her eternal accounting of human decisions and their consequences. And on certain nights, when the moon was dark and the highways empty, drivers passing through La Cruz del Diablo might glimpse a woman in white standing beneath the yellow lamp, her arm extended in the universal gesture of someone seeking a ride. Most drove on without stopping, a momentary chill their only souvenir of the encounter. But some, those with particular debts to pay or choices to make, found themselves slowing, pulling over, rolling down their windows to speak with the beautiful hitchhiker who knew their names without being told. The collector at the crossroads gathering her due. The vanishing station. 3 hours into an 8-hour drive through the Atacama Desert, Rafael Alvarez realized he had made a potentially fatal mistake. His car's fuel gauge hovered just above empty, the needle quivering with each bump on the desolate Chilean highway. According to his GPS, the next town was still 197 kilometers away, far beyond his remaining range. "Stupid, stupid, stupid," Rafael muttered, smacking the steering wheel. He was normally meticulous about filling up before remote stretches, especially on this route between Antofagasta and San Pedro de Atacama. But he'd been distracted, his mind consumed by the voicemail that had sent him rushing south in the first place. "Rafael, it's Elena, your father. He's taken a turn for the worse. The doctors don't think he'll last the week. If you want to say goodbye, you need to come now." Elena, his father's second wife, 20 years his junior, had never approved of Rafael's decision to move to Antofagasta after university, putting 800 kilometers between himself and his father's critical gaze. Their relationship had been strained for decades, ever since Rafael's mother died when he was 12. His father had retreated into emotional coldness, burying himself in work and leaving Rafael to essentially raise himself. Now at 34, Rafael was being called to the deathbed of a man who had been physically present but emotionally absent for most of his life. He wasn't sure what he felt, grief, obligation, or just a vague sense that this chapter needed proper closure. Whatever the emotion, it had distracted him enough to overlook the most basic rule of desert driving: never pass a gas station without filling up. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ruddy landscape. The Atacama was the driest, non-polar desert in the world, a Mars-like expanse of salt flats, rocky terrain, and absolute desolation. Beautiful but mercilessly indifferent to human survival needs. Rafael checked his phone, no signal. Another rule of desert travel he'd negligently broken. He should have told someone his route and expected arrival time. Now, if he ran out of gas and had to abandon his vehicle, he could easily become another sad statistic. The Atacama's extreme temperature fluctuations meant pleasant afternoon conditions could transform into freezing nights. Without proper clothing or shelter, hyperthermia was a real risk. Focus, he told himself. You need to find fuel or conserve what you have. He reduced his speed from 100 kilometers per h to 60, trying to maximize efficiency. He switched off the air conditioning despite the heat, rolled up the windows to minimize drag, and turned off the radio to prevent even the smallest energy drain on the battery. These measures might extend his range, but the math remained brutally simple. Even with optimal conservation, he didn't have enough fuel to reach the next town. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, turning the sky into a canvas of oranges and pinks, Raphael's anxiety increased. He'd seen no other vehicles for at least an hour. This highway, while the main route through the region, saw limited traffic, especially as evening approached. The chances of a random passerby stopping to help diminished with each passing minute. The fuel gauge now hovered just above the red warning section. Raphael estimated he had perhaps 20 kilometers of driving, left 30 at the absolute most. Unless a miracle occurred, he would be spending the night in his car, hoping for assistance in the morning. Then, just as the first stars became visible in the darkening eastern sky, Raphael spotted something on the horizon ahead, a small cluster of lights where nothing should exist according to his map. As he drew closer, the silhouette of a gas station emerged from the gathering darkness. "Impossible," he whispered, checking his GPS again. It still showed no services for nearly 200 kilometers in either direction. Yet there it stood, an old-fashioned service station with a small attached convenience store, its illuminated sign reading Estación Los Olvidados, Station of the Forgotten. Raphael was too relieved to question this stroke of luck. He pulled in beside the single set of pumps, noting the vintage design that seemed more appropriate to the 1960s than the present day. The entire station had an anachronistic quality, from the mechanical, not digital pump displays to the neon Abierto sign glowing in the store window. As Raphael stepped out of his car, the desert's nighttime chill already settling around him, he noticed the station's profound silence. No music played, no refrigeration units hummed, no distant traffic sounds penetrated the absolute stillness. The only noise was the soft ping of his car's cooling engine. He approached the fuel pump but found no credit card reader. It seemed to be a fully manual system requiring attendant service. Raphael looked toward the small store where warm yellow light spilled from windows, partially obscured by faded advertisements for products he hadn't seen since his childhood. A bell tinkled softly as he pushed open the door. The interior was neat but sparse, a few shelves of basic supplies, a refrigerated case containing drinks, and a counter with an ancient cash register. Behind the counter stood an elderly man with silver hair and the deeply lined face of someone who had spent decades under the desert sun. He wore a crisp blue uniform shirt with a patch that read Estación Los Olvidados over the breast pocket. "Good evening," Raphael said. "I need to fill up, please. I'm almost out of gas." The old man regarded him with calm, assessing eyes. "Many who find us are," he replied, his voice carrying the distinctive accent of Chile's northern regions. "How far are you trying to go?" "San Pedro de Atacama," Raphael answered. "My father is dying." He hadn't meant to share that personal detail, but something about the attendant's manner, a quiet dignity and attentiveness, had drawn it out of him. The old man nodded thoughtfully. "A difficult journey, then?" "Not just in distance." He reached beneath the counter and produced an old-fashioned metal key attached to a large wooden fob. "Pump 3, fill as needed. We'll settle the account after." Raphael took the key, noting its substantial weight and the worn edges that spoke of decades of use. "Thank you. Do you take credit cards?" A small smile crossed the attendant's weathered face. "We have alternative payment methods. We'll discuss it when you've filled your tank." Something about this response should have raised Raphael's suspicions, but his relief at finding fuel outweighed any concerns about unusual payment processes. He returned to his car and followed the simple procedure for the manual pump: insert key turn lift nozzle, begin fueling. The pump made a soothing mechanical clicking as the numbers on the analog display rolled over, counting the liters flowing into his tank. While waiting, Raphael observed the station more carefully. Despite its isolated location, everything was immaculately maintained. No rust on the pumps, no cracks in the concrete, no wind-blown debris collecting in corners. The lights cast perfect circles of illumination on the ground, unmarred by the clouds of insects that typically swarmed around desert light sources. Most strikingly, there was no visible road connecting the station to the highway beyond the immediate entrance and exit. It was as if the entire complex existed in its own bubble of reality, disconnected from the surrounding landscape. When the pump clicked off, indicating a full tank, Raphael replaced the nozzle and returned the key to the store. The old attendant had been joined by a woman of similar age, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her dress a style that might have been fashionable 4 or 5 decades earlier. "Ah, Teresa," the man said as Raphael entered. "This is the young man I mentioned, heading to San Pedro for a reconciliation." Raphael frowned slightly. "I didn't say anything about reconciliation, just that my father is dying." Teresa studied him with the same calm intensity as her companion. "Isn't that why you're going, one last chance to make peace?" The accuracy of her assessment unsettled Raphael. That was precisely what he'd been contemplating during his drive, whether he could find it in himself to forgive his father's emotional abandonment, whether there was any point in attempting reconciliation with a dying man. "How much do I owe you?" he asked, deliberately changing the subject as he pulled out his wallet. The old man waved away the gesture. "As I said, we have alternative methods of payment at Los Olvidados." "I don't understand," Raphael said. "Are you saying the gas is free?" "Nothing is free," Teresa replied. "Everything has its price, but not all prices are measured in currency." The old man nodded agreement. "Our station serves those with urgent journeys, physical or spiritual. In return, we ask only that travelers leave behind something that burdens them, something they carry that makes their journey heavier than it needs to be." Raphael looked back and forth between the elderly couple, wondering if he'd stumbled into some sort of cult or scam. Yet their expressions held no fanaticism or deception, only a profound patience, as if they were accustomed to confusion from their customers. "You want me to, what, leave behind a personal item?" Raphael asked, trying to make sense of their request. "Not a physical object," Teresa explained gently. "A memory, a grudge, a pain you've carried too long. Los Olvidados collects these things, lightening the loads of travelers so they can complete their journeys." Under normal circumstances, Raphael would have dismissed such talk as nonsense, made an excuse, and left. But the station's strange appearance out of nowhere, its anachronistic features, and the couple's unsettling ability to perceive his personal situation all suggested that this was no ordinary roadside stop. "You're saying you want me to tell you about my relationship with my father, and somehow that's payment for the gas?" he asked skeptically. "Not tell us," the old man corrected. "Release it. There's a difference. The telling is just the mechanism. The payment is in the unburdening." Raphael ran a hand through his hair, unsure how to respond. Part of him wanted to insist on paying with cash or card to maintain the transactional normalcy that governed the rest of the world. But another part, the part that had been wrestling with his father's impending death and all the unresolved emotion it stirred up, was curious about what this strange couple was offering. "I don't even know where to begin," he admitted finally. Teresa gestured toward a small door at the back of the store that Raphael hadn't noticed before. "Perhaps in the Sala de Reflexión it's more comfortable for these exchanges." Curiosity overcoming caution, Raphael followed the elderly couple through the door into what appeared to be a small living room. A stone fireplace with a gently crackling fire occupied one wall, casting warm light over comfortable but aged furniture. There were no windows yet. Somehow the room didn't feel claustrophobic, if anything. It gave the impression of being larger than the outside dimensions of the building should allow. "Please sit," Teresa said, indicating an armchair positioned near the fire. Raphael complied, finding the chair unexpectedly comfortable, as if it had somehow molded itself to his exact proportions. The old couple took seats opposite him, their faces half illuminated, half shadowed by the dancing firelight. "How does this work?" Raphael asked, still not entirely convinced he wasn't experiencing some sort of stress-induced hallucination. "Do I just talk?" "Start with a memory," the old man suggested. "The moment when the burden you carry became fixed in place." Almost without conscious intention, Raphael found himself speaking. "I was 12 when my mother died. Cancer. It happened quickly, diagnosis to death in 3 months. My father was destroyed by it. He'd loved her since they were teenagers, never even looked at another woman. After the funeral, he just shut down." The words came easier than Raphael had expected, flowing out as if they'd been waiting for release. He described how his father had retreated into work, leaving him to navigate adolescence with minimal guidance. How the emotional distance had grown until conversations became purely practical exchanges of necessary information. How he'd left for university feeling like an orphan despite having a living father. "The thing is," Raphael continued, the firelight playing across his features, "I understand it better now. Grief can break people. But when you're 12 and your mother dies, and then your father essentially disappears too, not physically, but in every way that matters, understanding comes much later than the damage." Teresa nodded, her eyes reflecting compassion without pity. "And now he's dying. And now he's dying," Raphael echoed. "After 20 years of emotional distance. He remarried eventually. Elena's been good for him, I think. But we never found our way back to each other. And now—" He trailed off, the weight of lost time and opportunity hanging in the air between them. "What is it you truly carry, Raphael?" the old man asked softly. "Name the burden so it can be set down." Raphael stared into the fire, watching the flames consume the wood, transforming solid matter into light and heat and ash. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Anger. Beneath everything, the distance, the awkward holiday visits, the cordial emails, there's this bedrock of anger. He was the adult. He should have found a way to be both grieving husband and present father. He made me carry my grief alone while carrying his too. I've been angry for 20 years, and I don't know how to stop." As he named this truth, Raphael felt something shift inside him, a constriction loosening like a hand unclenching after being held as a fist for too long. It was simultaneously painful and relieving, like blood flowing back into a numbed limb. "And what do you fear most about seeing him now?" Teresa asked. "That it's too late," Raphael answered immediately. "That we'll exchange pleasantries while avoiding anything meaningful, and then he'll die, and this chasm between us will become permanent, unbreachable." The old man leaned forward slightly. "You say you don't know how to stop being angry. Perhaps the question is, do you want to stop?" Raphael opened his mouth to answer automatically. Of course he wanted to stop being angry, but then closed it again, considering more carefully. The anger had been his companion for so long, a shield protecting him from further disappointment, a way of maintaining distance that felt safer than risking renewed connection and potential rejection. "I'm afraid of what's on the other side of the anger," he admitted finally. "Who am I in relation to my father if I'm not the son who was abandoned? What do we have left if I let go of that narrative?" "Perhaps that's what you need to discover," Teresa said gently. "Perhaps that's the real journey you're on. Not just the physical distance to San Pedro, but the emotional distance to a new understanding." As she spoke, Raphael noticed something strange happening with the firelight. It seemed to be concentrating in the center of the room, forming a column of gentle radiance between him and the elderly couple. Within this column he could see what appeared to be scenes from his own life himself as a child, with his father before his mother's illness, moments of connection that he'd forgotten or buried beneath subsequent pain. "What is that?" he whispered, mesmerized by the shifting images. "Memories you've kept but stopped seeing," the old man explained. the foundations that might support something new if you choose to build upon them. Raphael watched transfixed as the luminous column revealed moment after moment his father teaching him to ride a bicycle, staying up all night with him during a childhood fever, cheering at his school football matches, small moments of ordinary paternal love that had been overshadowed by the later years of distance. "I forgot," Raphael said, his voice catching. "I forgot he was ever any other way." "Pain has a way of rewriting our histories," Teresa said, "of making us believe the hurt is all there ever was." As the light column began to fade, Raphael felt a profound exhaustion settle over him, as if he'd completed some enormous physical task. But alongside the fatigue was a curious lightness, an absence where the hard knot of anger had resided for so long. "What just happened?" he asked, blinking as the room returned to normal. "Just three people sitting by an ordinary fire." "You paid your toll," the old man said simply. "Los Olvidados has accepted your burden." Raphael wanted to ask more about the strange light, about how any of this was possible, but found his thoughts becoming strangely diffuse, his eyelids heavy. "Rest now." Teresa's voice seemed to come from very far away. "When you wake, your journey will continue with a lighter load." Raphael tried to respond, but darkness was already claiming him a gentle descent into dreamless sleep. He awoke with a start to sunlight streaming through his car windows. For a disorienting moment he couldn't remember where he was or how he'd gotten there. He was in the driver's seat of his car, parked on the shoulder of the highway. The dashboard clock read 6:47 a.m. Raphael looked around frantically. There was no gas station, no store, no elderly couple, just the empty Atacama Desert stretching in all directions, the early morning sun painting the landscape in shades of gold and red. "A dream," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. It was just a dream. But when he checked his fuel gauge, the needle pointed to full. And when he stepped out of the car, stretching his stiff limbs, he noticed something else. A small wooden token on the driver's seat, carved with the words Estación Los Olvidados on one side and El Viaje Continúa on the other. The journey continues. Raphael held the token in his palm, its edges smooth as if from years of handling, though he couldn't remember touching it before this moment. As he stood on the empty highway, the token solid and real in his hand, he felt the absence of something he'd carried for decades, the hard, heavy knot of anger that had formed when his father withdrew after his mother's death. The anger wasn't entirely gone. That would have been too simple, too complete a transformation for one strange night. But it had changed, softened, become permeable in a way that allowed other emotions to exist alongside it. Understanding, regret, even the tentative hope for reconciliation. Raphael got back in his car, placed the wooden token carefully in his pocket, and continued his journey toward San Pedro de Atacama, toward his father, toward whatever new understanding might be possible in the time they had left. He arrived at his father's home by mid-morning. Elena answered the door, her face showing signs of prolonged stress and inadequate sleep. "Raphael," she said, genuine relief in her voice. "Thank God. He's been asking for you all night." Raphael followed her to the bedroom where his father lay, shockingly diminished from the imposing figure of Raphael's memory. Carlos Alvarez had always been a robust man, his physical presence commanding even as his emotional availability withered. Now he seemed shrunken, his skin yellow with liver failure, his breathing labored. "Papa," Raphael said softly, taking the chair beside the bed, "I'm here." Carlos's eyes fluttered open, taking a moment to focus. "Raphael," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp, "you came." "Of course I came," Raphael replied, surprised to find he meant it. It wasn't just obligation or ritual that had brought him here, but something deeper, more essential. "I need to say," Carlos began, but Raphael gently interrupted. "Rest, Papa. We have time." But they both knew that wasn't true. Carlos shook his head weakly. "No time," he insisted. "Need to say, I'm sorry. For after your mother, I failed you." Raphael felt something shift inside him. A door opening that had been locked for decades. In that moment he understood what the old man at Los Olvidados had meant about the unburdening being the payment. By acknowledging and releasing some of his anger the night before, he had created space for this moment to matter, for his father's words to reach him, rather than bouncing off the armor of his resentment. "I know, Papa," he said, taking his father's frail hand. "I understand better now. Grief makes us do things we later regret." Tears formed in Carlos's jaundiced eyes. "Too long," he whispered. "Wasted too many years." "We're here now," Raphael said, his own vision blurring. "That's what matters." In the 3 days that followed, Raphael rarely left his father's side. They talked more than they had in the previous 20 years, combined difficult, honest conversations interspersed with periods of companionable silence as Carlos's strength ebbed and flowed. They didn't solve everything. Decades of distance couldn't be completely bridged in a deathbed reconciliation. But they built something new in the time they had, fragile, imperfect, but real. Carlos Alvarez died peacefully on the 4th day with Rafael and Elena each holding one of his hands. In his grief, Rafael found himself reaching into his pocket fingers, closing around the wooden token from Estación Los Olvidados. It felt warm to the touch, almost alive, as if responding to his emotions. After the funeral, Rafael extended his leave from work, helping Elena sort through his father's belongings. It was during this process that he found the photograph album he'd never seen before. Images of himself growing up that his father had apparently collected from relatives and school publications, creating a visual record of the life he'd observed from a distance. The last page contained a note in his father's handwriting dated just 2 weeks earlier. "Raphael, if you're reading this, I've finally found the courage to say goodbye, but not the right words to heal what I broke. Know that my distance was never absence. I watched you grow into a man of strength and integrity from the shores of my grief, too afraid of drowning you in it to swim out and meet you. This was my failure, not yours. The love was always there, even when I couldn't show it. Your father, Carlos." That evening, Raphael stood on the small patio of his father's house watching the sunset paint the Atacama, with the same colors he'd seen the night he discovered Los Olvidados. He held the wooden token in his palm, its familiar weight, a reminder that the strange encounter had been real, whatever its explanation. In the 2 weeks since that night, Raphael had researched Estación Los Olvidados, extensively, finding nothing but local legends about a phantom gas station that appeared to travelers in desperate need. Some stories described it as a place of miracles, others as something more sinister that extracted terrible prices from those who stopped there. In all versions, the station vanished by morning, leaving travelers changed in ways both subtle and profound. As the last light faded from the sky, Raphael made a decision. Instead of returning directly to Antofagasta, he would retrace his route through the desert, looking for any sign of the station or the elderly couple who had facilitated his unburdening. He needed to understand what had happened to him to confirm that the experience had been more than a stress-induced hallucination. The next day he said goodbye to Elena, promising to stay in touch more regularly than he had with his father, and began the long drive north. He timed his journey to reach the approximate location of Los Olvidados around sunset, just as he had before. But as the hours passed and the landscape shifted from gold to purple with the setting sun, Raphael saw nothing but empty desert. No lights appeared on the horizon, no vintage gas station materialized where nothing should exist. He drove slowly, checking and rechecking his GPS coordinates, but found only the uninterrupted expanse of one of Earth's driest places. Eventually, he pulled over at a scenic viewpoint, watching as stars appeared in the darkening sky. He took the wooden token from his pocket, running his thumb over the carved words, "El viaje continua." The journey continues. Perhaps that was the point, Raphael reflected. Los Olvidados wasn't a place to return to, but a crossroads encountered when the traveler's need aligned with the station's purpose. It appeared not to offer fuel for vehicles, but to facilitate the release of burdens that made life's journey heavier than necessary. Its payment was the unburdening itself. the relief that came from setting down what you'd carried too long. As Rafael prepared to continue to Antofagasta, he noticed a pickup truck pulling into the viewpoint, its headlights briefly illuminating his car. The driver, a middle-aged woman with streaks of gray in her dark hair, nodded a greeting as she got out to stretch her legs. "Beautiful night," she commented in Spanish, glancing up at the star-filled sky. "It is," Rafael agreed. "Long drive ahead?" she asked. "Antofagasta. About 4 hours more." The woman nodded thoughtfully. "I'm heading to Calama myself. My daughter's expecting her first child." She hesitated, then added, "We haven't spoken in 3 years." A stupid argument that got out of hand. Raphael felt a familiar resonance in her words, another traveler carrying a burden of estrangement and unresolved emotion. Without fully understanding why, he reached into his pocket and withdrew the wooden token. "Here," he said, offering it to her, "for your journey." She looked at it curiously, reading the inscription. "Estación Los Olvidados." "I've never heard of it." "It's not on any map," Raphael said, "but it has a way of appearing when you need it most." The woman seemed about to question him further, but something in his expression made her simply nod and accept the token. "Gracias," she said, closing her fingers around it. "El viaje continúa," Raphael replied, feeling a sense of rightness in passing the token forward. As he drove away from the viewpoint, Raphael glanced in his rearview mirror. For just an instant, he thought he saw something impossible, the warm lights of a vintage gas station, materializing around the woman's parked truck and 2 elderly figures approaching to welcome her. Then he rounded a curve, and the vision, if it had been there at all, vanished from view. Raphael smiled and continued his journey, carrying his grief for his father, but no longer weighed down by the anger he'd left behind at Estación Los Olvidados. Somewhere in the vast Atacama, another traveler was perhaps unburdening their own chance to set down what made their journey heavier than it needed to be. And so it continued, this cycle of burden and release as eternal as the desert itself. Travelers in need of a station that appeared only to those with both physical and spiritual journeys to complete, and the elderly caretakers who collected not money but the heaviness that humans carried within them, transforming pain into the fuel for continuing one's path with a lighter heart. In the years that followed, Raphael often thought about his experience at Los Olvidados. He never again encountered the phantom station, though he made the Antofagasta-San Pedro drive many times. Sometimes, when passing through particularly desolate stretches of highway at dusk, he would find himself watching the horizon for a cluster of lights where nothing should be, but they never appeared. Whatever debt he'd owed had been paid. Whatever lesson he'd needed to learn had been absorbed. Yet occasionally he would meet someone at a cafe, on a bus, in a waiting room who carried the same heaviness he once had. A person weighed down by regret or anger or unresolved grief. And he would find himself sharing a modified version of his experience, careful to present it as a parable rather than a literal account. There's a station in the desert that collects burdens instead of currency. The unburdening itself is the payment. Some dismissed his story as metaphorical nonsense. Others listened with polite indifference. But a few, those who perhaps needed it most, would look at him with a sudden recognition, as if he'd put into words something they'd always known but never articulated. These were the ones who might find themselves someday pulling into a vintage gas station that appeared from nowhere just when their tank, physical or emotional, was running dangerously low. The station of the forgotten, collecting what needed to be left behind so that travelers could continue their journeys, unburdened by the weight of what no longer served them. El viaje continúa. Frequency 99. Juan, ¿estás seguro que sabes a dónde vamos? Sofia Navarro asked her boyfriend, eyeing the increasingly unfamiliar landscape outside the car window. "Are you sure you know where we're going?" Marco Ruiz responded with the confidence that had both attracted and infuriated Sofia throughout their 3-year relationship. "Claro que sí. My cousin's directions were very specific. This shortcut will save us at least an hour." Sophia wasn't convinced. For the past 20 minutes they'd been driving on an unmarked dirt road, cutting through the dense forest that surrounded Lake Nahuel Huapi in Argentine Patagonia. Their weekend getaway to Marco's cousin's cabin was supposed to be a romantic escape from their busy lives in Buenos Aires, but now it was starting to feel like the setup for every horror movie Sophia had ever watched. Your cousin Daniel, who gets lost in shopping malls, that's who gave you these very specific directions, Sophia teased, trying to mask her growing unease with humor. Marco grinned. He may be directionally challenged in cities, but he spent every summer at this cabin since he was a kid. Trust me, we'll be sitting by the lake with a glass of wine before sunset. Sophia checked her phone again. Still no signal. They'd lost reception shortly after turning off the main highway, another detail that heightened her anxiety. The rational part of her brain knew there was nothing to worry about. Remote areas often had spotty coverage in the dirt road, while rough showed signs of regular use. But another part, the part that had devoured too many suspense novels, whispered that isolation was always the first ingredient in disaster. As if reading her thoughts, Marco reached over and squeezed her hand. Relax. Daniel said we'd lose reception about 5 kilometers before reaching the cabin. It's actually a good sign that we're on the right track. Sophia managed a smile. I know. I just can't help thinking about all those horror movies that start with a couple taking a shortcut through the woods. If it makes you feel better, I promise to die heroically while you escape to get help, Marco said with mock solemnity. That's not funny, Sophia replied, though she couldn't suppress a laugh. Just focus on the road, please. It's getting darker. Indeed, the late afternoon light was fading, rapidly filtered through the dense canopy of southern beech trees that lined the narrow road. Their rental car, a modest Renault compact chosen for fuel efficiency rather than off-road capability, bounced over ruts and potholes, its suspension protesting with each impact. Marco switched on the headlights, which seemed feeble against the encroaching darkness. "Let's have some music," he suggested, turning on the radio. Static greeted them, which wasn't surprising given their remote location. Marco began scrolling through frequencies, finding nothing but white noise across the dial. He was about to give up when suddenly at 99.1 FM the static cleared, replaced by the crisp, professional voice of a radio announcer speaking in Spanish. "Welcome to frequency 99.1, your companion on the loneliest roads. This is Alejandro Vega bringing you music and conversation through the gathering darkness. It's 6:23 p.m. and you're currently driving on Ruta Secundaria 42, approximately 7 kilometers from your destination." Sophia and Marco exchanged startled glances. "That's weirdly specific," Sophia said. "How does he know exactly where we are?" Marco frowned, peering at the radio display. "Must be a local station with a very limited broadcast range. They probably only have one road to talk about." "But he said we're 7 kilometers from our destination." "How would he know where we're going?" Before Marco could respond, the announcer continued. "For our listeners just joining us, Sofia Navarro and Marco Ruiz, we have a special playlist selected for your journey to Lake Nahuel Huapi. The cabin awaits, but the path may hold unexpected turns. Stay with us through the darkness. We're here to guide you home." A chill ran down Sophia's spine. "Marco, this isn't funny. Did you set this up somehow? Some kind of prank?" "Of course not." Marco looked as disturbed as she felt. "How would I even do that? We rented this car 2 hours ago and neither of us has ever been to this area before." The radio began playing a hauntingly beautiful tango that Sophia recognized as Por una cabeza, coincidentally, or perhaps not one of her favorite pieces of music, though she couldn't recall ever mentioning this preference to Marco. "Turn it off," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. Marco reached for the dial, but before he could touch it, the music faded, and Alejandro Vega's voice returned. "Please don't adjust your dial, Sophia. The signal is fragile, and we have important information to share before you reach kilometer marker 5, information that may save your lives." Marco's hand froze above the radio controls. Despite her fear, Sophia found herself saying, "Wait. The announcer continued, his tone shifting from professional to intimately conversational. You're approaching a section of road where the boundaries between realities have grown thin. In approximately 3 minutes, you'll pass a weathered wooden sign marked Desvio Temporal. Most travelers miss it entirely. You must not. Turn left at the sign and follow that road for exactly 2.7 kilometers. This is insane, Marco muttered. But Sophia noticed he hadn't turned off the radio or dismissed the instructions outright. If you continue on your current path, the announcer warned, you'll encounter what locals call la niebla hambrienta, the hungry fog. Those who enter rarely emerge, and those who do are fundamentally changed. As if on cue, Sophia noticed tendrils of mist beginning to form between the trees ahead, ghostly white fingers reaching across the darkening road. "Marco," she whispered, pointing ahead, "look." The mist was thickening rapidly, transforming from isolated wisps to a wall of white that seemed to pulse with subtle movement as if breathing. The sight of it triggered a primal fear in Sophia, something beyond rational explanation. Every instinct screamed that whatever lay within that fog was dangerous in ways she couldn't articulate. "Probably just regular evening fog," Marco said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's common in forest areas near lakes." "Regular fog doesn't appear that suddenly," Sophia countered. "And it doesn't move like that." The announcer spoke again, his voice now urgent. "The sign approaches. You must decide quickly. The conventional path leads through La Niebla toward what you believe is your destination. The alternate route may seem longer, but will bring you safely to where you truly need to be." "This is ridiculous," Marco declared, accelerating slightly. "We are not going to change our plans because of some creepy local radio station playing mind games with travelers. It's probably a setup for tourists to create a spooky experience, then sell them overpriced protection trinkets at some gift shop down the road." "What if it's not?" Sophia pressed. "What if there really is something dangerous ahead?" "Like what? A fog that eats people," Marco scoffed. "Come on, Sophia. You're too rational to believe—" "There," Sophia interrupted, pointing to the right side of the road where a weathered wooden sign had appeared in their headlights. "Desvio Temporal." The sign looked ancient, its hand-painted letters faded but legible. A narrow dirt track veered left into the forest, barely visible in the gathering darkness. Just beyond the sign, the mist had grown so thick that the main road disappeared completely into an opaque white wall. Marco slowed the car, hesitating at the intersection. "This could be taking us completely off course," he argued. "Daniel didn't mention any alternate route or mysterious fog." "He also didn't mention a radio station that knows our names and destination," Sophia pointed out. "Please, Marco, something feels wrong about that fog. Let's just take the detour and see where it leads. If it's clearly going the wrong way, we can always turn back." From the radio, Alejandro Vega's voice emerged again. "Choose now. The fog waits for no one, and its hunger grows with the night." Marco looked from the sign to the advancing mist, then to Sophia's concerned face. With a sigh of resignation, he flicked on the turn signal, an absurd formality on the empty road, and guided the Renault onto the narrow track marked by the Desvio Temporal sign. "Fine," he conceded. "But if this adds 2 hours to our drive and we end up lost in the woods, I'm blaming you and this weird radio station." As they turned onto the secondary track, Sophia noticed two things simultaneously. The mist seemed to surge forward on the main road as if pursuing them, and the radio signal, which should have weakened as they drove deeper into the forest, actually strengthened the static clearing completely. "Thank you for heeding our warning," the announcer said, sounding genuinely relieved. "Many travelers dismiss our broadcasts as fiction or frequency anomalies. You've shown wisdom that may serve you well in the hours ahead." "What exactly are we avoiding?" Sophia asked aloud, not really expecting an answer from the radio. To her surprise, Alejandro responded as if she'd called into the station. "La niebla hambrienta is an anomaly that appears at certain intersections between worlds." Those who enter find themselves in places that resemble their intended destination but differ in subtle, insidious ways. Time passes differently there. Relationships dissolve. Identities shift. By the time most travelers realize something is wrong, the path back has already disappeared. "This is getting too weird," Marco muttered, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he navigated the increasingly rough terrain. "It's like he can hear us." "Of course I can hear you, Marco," the announcer confirmed. "Frequency 99.1 exists in the overlap between realities. We broadcast to those in transit between worlds, offering guidance when conventional navigation fails." Sophia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. "Are you saying we're between worlds right now?" "All travelers exist between states," Alejandro answered cryptically. "Between departure and arrival, between past and future, between certainty and possibility. Some roads make these transitions more literal than others." Marco shot Sophia an exasperated look. "Great! Our mysterious radio guide is also a philosopher." To the radio, he said sarcastically, "Any other cosmic wisdom to share, or can you just tell us how much further to the cabin?" There was a pause before Alejandro replied, his tone more serious. "The cabin you seek is no longer your destination, Marco. Events have shifted. Your cousin Daniel and his family evacuated 3 hours ago due to a forest fire approaching from the north." "What?" Marco exclaimed. "That's impossible. I spoke to Daniel this morning. He's expecting us." "In your original timeline, perhaps," the announcer said. "But you crossed a boundary when you turned onto this road. The reality you're now approaching has diverged from the one you left behind." Sophia felt a growing sense of dread. "If there's a fire, we need to turn around. Go back to the main highway." "The main road is no longer an option," Alejandro stated firmly. "La Niebla has fully manifested there. Your path now lies forward toward Lake Roca, not Nahuel Huapi. A ranger station near the lakeshore can provide shelter for the night." "Lake Roca?" Marco shook his head in disbelief. "That's at least 50 kilometers from where we're supposed to be. This is absurd." The road ahead steepened, forcing Marco to shift to a lower gear as they climbed through increasingly dense forest. The headlights seemed to penetrate less distance with each passing minute, as if the darkness itself was becoming more substantial, more resistant to illumination. "I understand your skepticism," the radio announcer acknowledged. "But consider what you've already witnessed, a broadcast that knows your names, your destination, the exact road you're traveling. The mist that appeared precisely as predicted. Are these merely elaborate coincidences, or might there be phenomena beyond your current understanding?" Sophia placed her hand on Marco's arm. "I know it sounds crazy, but I think we should listen. Something isn't right here, and whatever is happening, this Alejandro person seems to know more than we do." Marco opened his mouth to argue, but was interrupted by a sound from somewhere in the forest around them, a low, undulating moan that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. It wasn't the wind. The trees stood motionless in the still evening air. The sound rose in pitch, becoming almost a keening wail before abruptly cutting off. "What the hell was that?" Marco whispered, involuntarily slowing the car. "The displaced," Alejandro answered promptly. "Those who entered La Niebla in various times and places only to be redistributed across realities. They exist in fragments now, neither fully here nor entirely gone. They sense your passage and are drawn to your wholeness." Another moan rose from the darkness, closer this time, accompanied by a rustling movement in the underbrush parallel to the car. Sophia peered out the window but could see nothing beyond the reach of the headlights. "Keep driving," she urged Marco. "Don't stop." "Wise counsel," the announcer agreed. "Movement is safety. The displaced cannot maintain pursuit for long. Their fragmented nature makes sustained action difficult." Marco accelerated as much as the rough track would allow, the Renaults bouncing violently over exposed roots and rocks. "I still think this could be an elaborate prank," he said. though his white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel belied his skepticism. Maybe there's a local tour guide monitoring the road with night vision goggles feeding information to this Alejandro person to freak out tourists. For what purpose, Sophia challenged. To scare us onto a different road away from a legitimate danger like a forest fire. That's a lot of effort for a public service. Before Marco could respond, the car's engine sputtered and died, the headlights flickering out simultaneously. Momentum carried them forward a few more meters before the vehicle rolled to a stop in the middle of the narrow forest track. "No, no, no," Marco muttered, turning the key repeatedly in the ignition. The engine made a grinding noise but refused to start. This can't be happening. The rental agency said the car was just serviced. The radio strangely continued to function despite the electrical failure affecting the rest of the vehicle. Alejandro's voice emerged from the speakers, tense with urgency. "You must leave the car immediately. The displaced are converging on your position. Their attention fixates on technology, anything that bridges realities as they once did." As if to confirm his warning, multiple moans arose from the surrounding forest, closer than before and coming from all directions. Sophia could now distinguish words embedded in the eerie sounds, fragmentary phrases in multiple languages, overlapping and disjointed like a dozen radio stations playing simultaneously. "I don't think this is a prank anymore," she whispered, reaching for the door handle. "Wait!" Marco hissed, grabbing her arm. "We can't just abandon the car and wander through an unfamiliar forest at night. That's suicide." "Remaining is the greater danger," Alejandro insisted. "The displaced cannot fully materialize in your reality, but proximity to their fragmented existence can cause degradation of your own cohesion. You must move, now." A pale shape flitted between the trees, just at the edge of visibility, a humanoid figure that seemed to stutter through space rather than move continuously, appearing and disappearing in rapid sequence rather than walking normally. "Marco," Sophia said, her voice tight with fear. "Look!" More figures were emerging from the darkness, all moving with that same stuttering, fragmentary motion as if they existed in multiple positions simultaneously or were rapidly cycling between different states of being. Their forms were indistinct human-shaped, but blurred like long exposure photographs of people in motion. "This cannot be real," Marco whispered, but he was already reaching for his door handle. "Take only what you can carry in one trip," Alejandro advised. "Move perpendicular to the road uphill to the east. There is a ridge approximately 400 meters from your position." The displaced rarely venture above certain elevations. The thinning of reality at higher altitudes is uncomfortable for their already tenuous existence. Sophia grabbed her backpack, which contained her wallet phone, a water bottle, and a light jacket. Marco did the same, adding a flashlight from the glove compartment. They exited the car simultaneously, the cool night air raising goosebumps on Sophia's arms. The forest was preternaturally silent. No insects chirping, no leaves rustling, just the soft, disconnected moaning of the approaching figures. The nearest was now close enough that Sophia could see hints of facial features in its blurred form, eyes that didn't align properly, a mouth that seemed to occupy multiple positions simultaneously. "East," Marco muttered, orienting himself, using the car's position on the north-south road. "This way, uphill." They began climbing through the underbrush, the beam of Marco's flashlight bouncing erratically as they scrambled over fallen logs and pushed through dense ferns. Sophia clutched her small handheld radio, the source of the mysterious broadcast, unwilling to leave behind their only connection to Alejandro's guidance. "The displaced are following," the announcer reported, his voice emerging clearly despite the physical exertion that should have made it difficult for Sophia to hear the small device. "But their manifestation weakens as you ascend. Continue upward." The climb grew steeper, the forest giving way to rockier terrain with scattered wind-twisted trees. Sophia's legs burned with effort, her breath coming in sharp gasps in the thinning air. Marco led the way, periodically turning to make sure she was keeping pace. When they paused briefly to rest, Sophia looked back the way they had come. In the valley below, faint luminous forms moved among the trees, dozens of them now converging on the abandoned car, their stuttering movements creating a bizarre visual effect like malfunctioning strobe lights. "What are they doing?" she asked breathlessly. "Searching," Alejandro replied through the radio, "for anchors to your reality, objects that might allow them to strengthen their manifestation." As he spoke, the figures surrounding the car became more agitated, their movements faster, their moaning louder. Then, as if responding to some silent signal, they converged on the vehicle. The moment they made contact, the car's headlights blazed to life with impossible brightness, illuminating the forest in harsh white light. Sophia gasped as the displaced figures became fully visible in the sudden illumination. They were people, or had been once, but now appeared fundamentally wrong, as if assembled incorrectly. Some had features duplicated or missing entirely. Others seemed to consist of overlapping versions of themselves like multiple exposure photographs. All moved with that characteristic stuttering motion existing in multiple positions simultaneously. "Do not look directly at them," Alejandro warned. "Their fractured existence can imprint on your perception, making it difficult to maintain your own temporal coherence." Sophia tore her gaze away, focusing instead on Marco's back as they resumed climbing. The ridge Alejandro had mentioned came into view ahead, a rocky outcropping that rose above the tree line silhouetted against the star-filled sky. "Almost there," Marco encouraged, reaching back to take Sophia's hand. They had nearly reached the ridge when Sophia's foot slipped on loose scree, sending her tumbling several meters back down the slope. The small radio flew from her hand, clattering against rocks before coming to rest in a shallow depression. "Sophia," Marco called, scrambling back toward her. "I'm okay," she assured him, though her ankle throbbed painfully when she tried to put weight on it. "Just twisted my ankle. Get the radio." Marco retrieved the device, which had miraculously survived the fall intact. Alejandro's voice emerged immediately, more urgent than before. "You must reach the ridge before moonrise. The boundaries between realities thin further under the full moon, allowing greater manifestation of the displaced." Sophia looked eastward, where the curve of the moon was already becoming visible above the distant mountains. "Marco, help me up. We need to hurry." With Marco supporting much of her weight, they resumed their ascent at a painfully slow pace. Sophia bit her lip to keep from crying out each time her injured ankle took pressure. The moon continued to rise, its silvery light intensifying by the minute. "Faster," Alejandro urged. "They're ascending now, drawn by your increased vulnerability." Sophia glanced back and immediately wished she hadn't. The displaced were indeed climbing the slope below them, their fractured forms more substantial in the moonlight. As she watched, one flickered and reappeared much closer than should have been possible with normal movement. "They're teleporting or something," she gasped. "Marco, we need to move faster." "You can barely walk," he protested, but increased their pace, nonetheless practically dragging Sophia up the increasingly steep incline. The ridge was tantalizingly close now, perhaps 50 meters ahead. But Sophia's injury was slowing them dramatically, and the displaced were gaining ground with their impossible stuttering progress up the slope. "You must separate," Alejandro said suddenly, his voice cutting through their labored breathing. "Marco, take Sophia's radio and continue to the ridge. Sophia, conceal yourself among the rocks to your right. Your divided presence will confuse the displaced, temporarily allowing at least one of you to reach safety." "No way," Marco responded instantly. "I'm not leaving Sophia." "It's our best chance," Sophia argued, already pulling away from his supporting arm. "Go, Marco! Reach the ridge and then guide me from there." "This is insane," Marco protested. "We don't even know if being on the ridge actually protects us from these things." "The ridge marks a boundary," Alejandro explained rapidly. A natural division between overlapping realities. Crossing it will place you beyond the displaced's limited range of manifestation, but you must hurry. Moonrise is nearly complete. A strange, fragmented wail rose from the slope below them, closer than either had realized. Sophia pushed Marco away forcefully. "Go, I'll hide and follow when I can." Reluctantly, Marco took the radio and continued upward while Sophia limped toward a cluster of large boulders to her right. Finding a narrow space between two rocks, she squeezed inside and made herself as small as possible, trying to control her ragged breathing. From her hiding place, Sophia could see the displaced creatures pausing on the slope, their fractured forms seeming to vibrate with confusion as they registered the separation of their quarry. After a moment of apparent indecision, most continued upward, following Marco's more direct trail toward the ridge. Several others, however, began moving toward Sophia's position, their stuttering progress bringing them inexorably closer to her hiding place. Sophia pressed herself deeper into the crevice, ignoring the sharp stones digging into her back. She could no longer see the creatures, but could hear their disjointed moaning growing louder. Then suddenly a different sound cut through the night, Alejandro's voice, but no longer coming through the radio that Marco carried. Instead, it seemed to emanate from the air itself, clear and commanding. "Fragmentos del espacio-tiempo, escúchenme. Soy Alejandro Vega, guardián de los límites. Les ordeno que se dispersen." The language was Spanish, but the words carried a resonance that transcended mere sound, vibrating through Sophia's body like physical force. The displaced responded immediately, their moaning shifting to a high-pitched keening before falling silent. When Sophia dared to peek from her hiding place, the nearest creatures had vanished. On the slope above, she could see Marco had nearly reached the ridge. The displaced pursuing him had also stopped, their forms becoming increasingly transparent in the moonlight rather than more substantial as before. Sophia emerged cautiously from her hiding place, testing her injured ankle. It still hurt, but the pain had subsided from sharp agony to a dull throb. Gritting her teeth, she began to climb again, moving from boulder to boulder for support. Above her, Marco had reached the ridge and was waving frantically, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness to guide her. The remaining displaced had retreated, maintaining distance as Sophia made her painful way upward. When she finally reached the top, Marco pulled her into a tight embrace. "Are you okay? What happened down there? They just suddenly stopped pursuing." Before Sophia could answer, Alejandro's voice emerged from the radio in Marco's pocket. "You've crossed the boundary. You're safe now, at least from the displaced. But your journey is not yet complete." Marco retrieved the radio. "What just happened? How did you make those things retreat?" "I exist in multiple states simultaneously," Alejandro explained, his voice somehow conveying both weariness and satisfaction. "Like the displaced, but with greater cohesion and purpose. I can exert limited influence under certain conditions, particularly at convergence points like moonrise." "Who are you?" Sophia asked. "What are you?" A slight chuckle came through the speaker. "I was once like you, a traveler who took a wrong turn and encountered La Niebla Hambrienta. Unlike most, I maintained enough self-awareness to realize what was happening as my existence began fragmenting across realities. I found this frequency 99.1, which resonates at the precise vibration that bridges overlapping worlds. I've used it ever since to guide others away from my fate." Sophia and Marco exchanged bewildered glances, the implications of Alejandro's explanation sinking in slowly. "So you're trapped between realities?" Sophia asked. "Trapped implies a desire to escape," Alejandro replied thoughtfully. "I've found purpose in this state of being. Not everyone who becomes displaced suffers eternally. Some like me find new forms of existence. Others eventually fade, their fragments dispersing into the background resonance of reality itself." "And us?" Marco asked, gesturing at the moonlit landscape around them. "Where exactly are we now? You said something about our timeline diverging." You're in a variation of your world where certain events unfolded differently, Alejandro confirmed. The forest fire that forced your cousin's evacuation doesn't exist in your original reality. Other differences will become apparent as you continue your journey. Sophia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Can we get back to our original reality? A pause longer than any before stretched between Alejandro's words. That path is complicated, and not without risk. For now, you must continue forward. The ranger station at Lake Roca will provide shelter for tonight. From there, we can discuss possible routes back to a reality more closely aligned with your point of origin. This is insane, Marco muttered, rubbing his temples. Time travelers, parallel dimensions, displaced people fragments. It's like a bad science fiction movie. Yet you witnessed it all firsthand, Alejandro pointed out. Reality is far more flexible, more layered than most humans perceive. Your limited senses detect only a narrow band of existence, the layer that most directly impacts your survival. But countless other realities intersect with yours at every moment, separated by barriers thinner than you might imagine. Sophia lowered herself carefully onto a flat rock, her injured ankle throbbing painfully. So what now? We just continue to this ranger station and hope you can figure out how to send us back to our proper reality. For tonight, yes, Alejandro confirmed. Rest is essential. Reality shifting takes a toll on physical bodies accustomed to temporal and dimensional stability. Tomorrow, with proper guidance, you may begin the process of finding your way home. Marco sat beside Sophia, his earlier skepticism replaced by shell-shocked acceptance. And if we can't get back, what then? Then you adapt, Alejandro said simply. As all displaced must eventually do, but that bridge need not be crossed tonight. For now, follow the ridge eastward. It descends gradually toward Lake Roca. The ranger station lights will be visible once you clear the tree line. Following Alejandro's directions, Sophia and Marco began moving along the rocky ridge, the full moon providing ample light for navigation. Sophia leaned heavily on Marco, her injured ankle making progress slow but steady. Below them, the forest stretched in dark waves, occasionally broken by the stuttering luminescence of the displaced, though none ventured near the ridge. After nearly an hour of careful hiking, they reached a point where the ridge began to slope downward. In the distance, the moonlight revealed the silver surface of what must be Lake Roca, and near its shore the warm yellow glow of artificial lights, presumably the ranger station Alejandro had mentioned. "I see it," Sophia said, pointing. "It looks so normal, so ordinary." "Most divergent realities maintain broad similarities," Alejandro explained through the radio. "Major geographical features, human settlements, fundamental physical laws, these tend to remain constant across adjacent timelines. It's the details that shift individual choices, specific events, personal histories." The descent toward the lake was easier than their frantic climb had been, though Sophia's ankles still protested each step. As they drew closer to the ranger station, they could make out a solid wooden structure with a broad porch and a radio tower beside it, exactly the sort of building one would expect to find in a national park. "It looks so real," Marco murmured. "How can we be in a different reality when everything appears so normal?" "Your senses interpret this world through familiar frameworks," Alejandro said. "The fundamental differences exist at levels you cannot readily perceive. But they are there nonetheless." When they finally reached the ranger station, a middle-aged man in a Park Service uniform emerged onto the porch, alerted by their approach. "Hola, necesitan ayuda." "Hello, do you need help?" Marco explained that they had become lost while hiking, and that Sophia had injured her ankle. The ranger, introducing himself as Carlos Mendoza, immediately invited them inside, his concern appearing entirely genuine. He made no comment about their arrival on foot in the middle of the night, treating the situation as unusual, but not extraordinary. Inside, the station was warm and well lit, with maps covering the walls, and a radio system similar to those in ranger stations in their own reality. Carlos provided first aid for Sophia's ankle, confirming it was merely sprained rather than broken, and offered them food and coffee. "You're lucky," Carlos commented as he wrapped Sophia's ankle. "There's been a forest fire near Lake Nahuel Huapi. The whole area was evacuated this afternoon. If you'd gone that way, you might have been in real trouble." Sophia and Marco exchanged meaningful glances. Alejandro had been telling the truth about the fire in this reality. "Is there anywhere we can stay tonight?" Marco asked. "We've lost our car and all our camping equipment." "You can stay here," Carlos offered readily. "We have emergency accommodations for stranded hikers. In the morning, I can radio for transportation to the nearest town." As Carlos showed them to a small but comfortable room with bunk beds, Sophia kept a tight grip on the radio, which had remained silent since their arrival at the station. Once they were alone, she placed it on a small table between the bunks. "Alejandro," she called softly, "are you still there?" After a moment, the radio crackled to life, though the voice that emerged was fainter than before, overlaid with subtle static. "I am here, though my connection weakens." This location is grounded more firmly in its reality, making cross-dimensional broadcast more difficult. "What happens tomorrow?" Marco asked, sitting on the lower bunk. "How do we get back to our own timeline or dimension or whatever it is?" "There are methods," Alejandro replied carefully. "Points where realities intersect more prominently, allowing for transition under specific conditions. La Niebla itself is one such intersection, though its chaotic nature makes controlled passage extremely dangerous." "So we have to go back through the mist thing that you warned us to avoid?" Sophia asked incredulously. "Not necessarily. There are other crossing points more stable, more predictable. One exists near this very lake, though accessing it requires precise timing and certain sacrifices." "What kind of sacrifices?" Marco asked warily. A pause stretched before Alejandro answered. "To move between realities, something must be left behind. A physical object, a memory occasionally, something more significant. The nature of the sacrifice corresponds to the distance between realities." "And how distant is our original reality from this one?" Sophia pressed. "Closer than many, more distant than some," Alejandro hedged. "We will determine the specific requirements tomorrow. For now, rest. Transition is easier with a clear mind and rested body." Despite their extraordinary circumstances, exhaustion soon overcame both Sophia and Marco. The last thing Sophia remembered before drifting off was the sound of static from the radio, punctuated by occasional fragments of Alejandro's voice, as if he were speaking to someone else entirely. Sophia awoke to sunlight streaming through a small window. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was or how she'd gotten there. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back. The mysterious radio broadcast, the mist, the displaced creatures, the ridge crossing that had brought them to this divergent reality. Marco was already awake, sitting at the small table and staring at the radio, which remained silent despite his apparent attempts to activate it. He looked up as Sophia stirred. "I can't get him back," he said without preamble. "Alejandro, the radio works. I can pick up regular stations, but nothing on 99.1. Just static." Sophia swung her legs carefully over the edge of the bunk, testing her ankle. The swelling had subsided significantly overnight, though it still ached when she put weight on it. "Maybe the crossing points are time-dependent, like he said. Perhaps he can only reach us at certain times." Before Marco could respond, there was a knock at the door. Carlos entered with a tray of coffee and bread, his manner as friendly and normal as it had been the night before. "Buenos dias," he greeted them. "I hope you slept well." They thanked him for the breakfast, and he informed them that he had radioed for a park service vehicle to take them to the nearest town that afternoon. "From there, you can arrange transportation back to wherever you need to go," he added. After Carlos left, Sophia turned to Marco with a worried expression. "What if we can't contact Alejandro again? Do we just stay here, try to build new lives in this reality where our cousin's cabin burned down, and who knows what else is different?" Marco ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I don't know. Part of me still can't believe this is really happening. Maybe we hallucinated everything last night. Carbon monoxide leak in the car or some kind of toxic fungus in the forest releasing spores. That doesn't explain how we ended up miles from where we should be, Sophia pointed out. Or the ranger confirming the fire at Lake Nahuel Huapi that Alejandro warned us about. They fell silent, the implications of their situation too overwhelming to process fully. If this truly was an alternate reality, how different was it from their own? Did versions of themselves exist here? Were their families the same? Their histories? The questions multiplied without answers. After breakfast, Carlos invited them to explore the station and surrounding area while waiting for their transportation. Sophia's ankle had improved enough for short walks, so they ventured onto the porch where the view of Lake Roca spread before them, its waters a deep blue under the morning sun. "It's beautiful," Sophia murmured. "It looks exactly like it would in our reality." How would we even know if things were different, Marco wondered aloud. Without specific points of comparison, this world seems identical to ours. They spent the morning in a strange limbo, outwardly acting like ordinary tourists who had experienced a minor mishap while internally grappling with their extraordinary displacement across realities. Carlos, for his part, treated them with casual friendliness, apparently finding nothing unusual about them or their situation. It was nearly noon when the radio in their room suddenly crackled to life, Alejandro's voice emerging clearly despite no one having touched the device. "Frequency 99.1 resuming transmission. Sophia, Marco, if you can hear me, respond immediately. Our window for communication is brief." They rushed back to the room, Sophia ignoring the pain in her ankle. Marco grabbed the radio. "We're here. Where did you go?" "Cross-dimensional broadcasting is subject to temporal fluctuations," Alejandro explained rapidly. "I can maintain connection for approximately 17 minutes before the frequencies desynchronize again." Listen carefully. There is a crossing point on the eastern shore of Lake Roca marked by 3 standing stones arranged in a triangle. You must reach it by sunset today if you wish to return to your original reality. "Today," Sophia exclaimed, "but the park ranger has arranged transportation for us this afternoon." "You must decline it," Alejandro insisted. "The alignment of realities at the crossing point occurs only once every 33 days. Miss it and you'll remain in this divergent timeline until the next alignment." Marco paced the small room. "And how exactly do we use this crossing point? You mentioned sacrifices." "The transition requires an exchange," Alejandro confirmed. "Something of equivalent value to what you seek to regain. In your case, returning to your original reality will require each of you to sacrifice something personally significant, an object, a memory, perhaps more." "Define perhaps more," Sophia said warily. A hesitation before Alejandro answered. "The exact nature of the sacrifice is determined at the moment of crossing. It corresponds to the degree of divergence between realities and the strength of your connection to your point of origin." "So we don't even know what we'll have to give up until we're already committed?" Marco asked incredulously. "That is correct. The crossing point responds to each traveler individually. I cannot predict what it will require of you specifically." Sophia and Marco exchanged concerned glances, the implication settling heavily between them. "What if we choose to stay here?" Sophia asked finally. "Live in this reality instead." "That is your choice," Alejandro acknowledged. "But consider carefully, this world already has versions of you in it. They may not be identical to you. The divergence point likely created subtle or significant differences, but they exist. Your presence creates a duplication that reality tends to resolve one way or another." "Resolve how?" Marco pressed. "Through convergence, typically. Over time, displaced versions of the same person often find their memories, personalities, and even physical characteristics merging. Eventually, only one integrated version remains, usually more aligned with the native reality than the displaced one." "So we'd forget who we really are?" Sophia asked, horrified. "Be absorbed into our alternates in this world?" Gradual personality dissolution is the most common outcome for those who remain in non-native realities, Alejandro confirmed, though the process can take years, even decades. The radio signal began to deteriorate static, increasingly interrupting Alejandro's words. Our connection weakens. You must decide quickly. To reach the crossing point by sunset, you should depart within the hour. Take the eastern trail from the ranger station approximately 6 kilometers to the Standing Stones. Wait, Marco called as the static intensified. How will we know what to do when we get there? I will attempt to re-establish contact near the crossing point, Alejandro's voice came through brokenly. If I cannot trust your instincts, the boundary will recognize your displacement and options for return. The transmission dissolved completely into static, then silence. Marco switched the radio off, then on again, but frequency 99.1 had vanished once more. So that's it, Sophia said after a moment. Either we try for this crossing point and give up who knows what, or we stay here and gradually lose ourselves anyway. Some choice, Marco muttered bitterly, but I don't see that we have any real alternatives. They quickly packed their minimal belongings, debating how to explain their sudden departure to Carlos. In the end, they settled on a partial truth that they had received a radio message from friends who could pick them up from the eastern shore of the lake, making the Park Service transportation unnecessary. Carlos seemed mildly surprised but untroubled by their change of plans. He provided them with a basic map of the lake trail's extra water and some food for their journey. His complete normality in the face of their extraordinary circumstances was almost surreal, a stark reminder of how aligned this divergent reality was with their own in most surface aspects. The eastern trail was well maintained and clearly marked, winding through pine forest before opening to periodic views of the lake. Sophia's ankle protested the extended hike, but the injury had improved enough to allow steady progress. As they walked, they discussed what sacrifices the crossing point might demand and whether they were prepared to pay such a price. What if it wants something crucial, Marco wondered. A vital memory like everything about our childhood or our entire relationship? Would you rather stay here and slowly have your identity erased anyway? Sophia countered. At least this way we make a conscious choice about what we lose. The sun was lowering toward the western mountains when they finally spotted what had to be the crossing point. 3 tall, weathered stone monoliths arranged in a perfect equilateral triangle on a small promontory extending into the lake. Each stone was approximately 3 meters tall, covered in faint carvings that seemed to shift and change when viewed peripherally. As they approached the stones, Sophia felt a strange sensation, a subtle vibration that she perceived not through touch or hearing, but somewhere deeper, as if her very atoms were resonating with the sight. Marco evidently felt it too, his pace slowing as they entered the triangle's perimeter. It feels alive somehow, he murmured, reaching out to touch the nearest monolith. As his fingers made contact, the carvings momentarily glowed with a soft blue light before fading back to normal. Sophia approached another of the stones, noticing that the carvings seemed to depict human figures in various postures, some entering circular portals, others emerging, many leaving objects behind, or appearing to reach toward something just beyond their grasp. The imagery confirmed Alejandro's explanation of the site's purpose. Now what? Marco asked, looking around. Alejandro said he'd try to contact us here, but I'm not hearing anything. As if in response, their small radio, which had remained silent since Alejandro's last transmission, suddenly emanated a soft hum. But instead of Alejandro's voice, a different sound emerged, a harmonic tone that perfectly matched the vibration Sophia had been feeling since entering the triangle. The tone grew steadily louder, and as it did, the space between the 3 monoliths began to shimmer, the air taking on an opalescent quality like heat waves above hot asphalt, but more structured, more intentional. Within this distortion, images began to form, fleeting glimpses of what appeared to be the same location in different states, covered in snow, bathed in summer sunlight, occupied by different structures or people from various time periods. It's showing us different versions of this place, Sophia realized. Different realities. The shifting images gradually stabilized, focusing on a scene that looked identical to their current surroundings but subtly different in quality, the light slightly warmer, the colors marginally more vibrant. Instinctively, Sophia knew they were seeing their home reality. "That's it," she said with certainty. "That's our way back." As they watched, the image expanded until it filled the entire space between the monoliths, creating what appeared to be a doorway to another version of the same location. Through this portal, they could see the three standing stones from their original reality, positioned exactly as they were in this divergent world. Sophia took a step toward the shimmering doorway but felt an invisible resistance, as if pushing against an elastic membrane. The radio's tone shifted, becoming more complex, resolving into something that wasn't quite language but nevertheless conveyed meaning directly to her consciousness. Exchange required for passage. The impression came not as words but as pure concept, understood rather than heard. Sophia looked at Marco, who nodded, indicating he had received the same communication. "What do we need to give?" Marco asked aloud. In response, the shimmering doorway flickered and two distinct areas of brightness appeared within it, one before Sophia, one before Marco. The radio's tone shifted again, and Sophia received another conceptual impression. "Place, offering here." "I think we need to put something in those bright spots," she said to Marco. "Something significant to us." Marco reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. After a moment's hesitation, he removed a worn photograph, a picture of his deceased father, that he had carried for over a decade. "This is the most valuable thing I have with me," he said quietly. Sophia considered what she could offer. She wore a silver bracelet that had belonged to her grandmother, a family heirloom passed down through generations. With a pang of regret, she unclasped it from her wrist. Together they approached the shimmering doorway. Marco placed the photograph in his designated area of brightness, while Sophia did the same with her bracelet. For a moment, nothing happened. Then both objects began to glow with the same opalescent quality as the portal itself, gradually fading from view as they were absorbed into the boundary between realities. The radio emitted a new tone, and another conceptual message formed in their minds. Insufficient exchange for full passage. Sophia felt her heart sink. "Our offerings aren't enough," she said to Marco. "We need to give something more." Before Marco could respond, the portal flickered again, and new impressions flooded their consciousness, not demands, but options, possibilities for what each might surrender to complete the exchange. For Sophia, the memory of your first love or 5 years of creative potential. For Marco, the ability to return to this reality or the reconciliation with your estranged brother. The choices were devastatingly personal, targeting aspects of their identities that defined core parts of who they were. Sophia's first love had shaped her understanding of relationships for years afterward. Her creative potential was central to her self-image as an artist. Marco's estrangement from his brother was a painful wound he had long hoped to heal. "How does it know these things about us?" Marco whispered, shaken by the precision of the options presented. "It must read us somehow," Sophia replied, equally disturbed. "See into our minds or souls or whatever makes us who we are." They stood in silence for a long moment, each contemplating their impossible choices. The sun was now touching the western mountains. They had perhaps 20 minutes before sunset, when, according to Alejandro, the alignment would end. "I'll give up my ability to return here," Marco said finally. "It's not like I was planning on reality hopping again anyway." Sophia nodded, understanding his choice. For herself, the decision was agonizing. Her first love had been formative, but those memories, while precious, were part of her past. Her creative potential was her future, her planned career as a graphic designer, her dreams of one day publishing her illustrations. "I'll surrender the memory of my first love," she decided reluctantly. I need my creativity intact. As they made their decisions, the areas of brightness in the portal intensified, seeming to acknowledge their choices. The radio emitted a tone that somehow conveyed acceptance, and the conceptual voice returned approach and confirm exchange. Sophia and Marco moved closer to the shimmering boundary, each standing before their designated area of brightness. As they did, Sophia felt a gentle, probing sensation in her mind, focusing on the memories of her first relationship, the awkward teenage courtship, the intensity of first passion, the devastating heartbreak that followed. She understood that these memories were being evaluated, their emotional weight and significance measured against the energy required for trans-dimensional passage. Beside her, Marco was presumably experiencing something similar regarding his chosen sacrifice. His expression showed concentration and a hint of regret, but also determination. Exchange accepted, passage granted. The conceptual message came with a surge of energy that rippled through the portal, transforming it from a shimmering distortion to a clear opening between realities. Through it, Sophia could now see their original world with perfect clarity, the same lake, the same stones, but somehow recognizably home. Now, Sophia said, gripping Marco's hand, before sunset. Together they stepped forward into the brightness. Sophia felt a moment of disorientation as her consciousness seemed to expand in all directions, simultaneously encompassing multiple versions of herself across countless realities. For an eternal instant she existed everywhere and nowhere, connected to every possible variation of Sophia Navarro throughout the multiverse. Then abruptly she was herself again, singular specific, standing between three stone monoliths on the shore of Lake Roca, in what she instinctively knew was her original reality. Marco stood beside her, still holding her hand, his expression suggesting he had experienced something similar. Behind them, the portal collapsed with a soft implosion of air, leaving only empty space between the standing stones. The sun was just disappearing behind the western mountains, its last rays illuminating the scene with golden light. "Did it work?" Marco asked, looking around. "Are we home?" Sophia felt different. There was a vague sense of something missing, a fuzziness around certain memories from her adolescence. She could still recall dating someone in high school, still knew intellectually that it had been significant. But the emotional content, the sensory details, the specificity of that relationship had vanished, leaving only the abstract knowledge that it had occurred. "I think so," she said. "I can feel what I gave up. My memories of Daniel, my first boyfriend, they're technical now, like reading someone else's biography. I know what happened, but I can't feel it anymore." Marco nodded slowly. "And I know somehow that I can never go back to that other reality, not just practically but fundamentally. That possibility has been closed to me permanently." They stood in silence for a moment, absorbing the significance of their sacrifices and their return. Then Sophia's phone chimed, a normal, everyday sound that seemed surreal after their extraordinary experiences. She looked at the screen in surprise. "I have signal," she exclaimed, opening her messages, "and text from your cousin Daniel. Listen to this. Where you guys been waiting at the cabin all day? Everything okay?" Marco pulled out his own phone, which also showed full signal strength. "No forest fire," he said, scrolling through news alerts. "No evacuation. In this reality, Daniel's cabin is fine and he's expecting us right now." The normalcy of it was almost shocking after what they had experienced. Their crossing had worked. They were back in their original reality, where their weekend plans remained intact, where the divergence that had caused the forest fire had never occurred. A crackling sound drew their attention to the small radio Sophia still carried. From its speaker, Alejandro's voice emerged, fainter than before, but still recognizable. "Well done. You have successfully traversed the boundary. Your timeline is restored, though you each carry the mark of your journey and what you have sacrificed." Alejandro, Sophia responded quickly. "Thank you for guiding us home." "It is my purpose," he replied simply, "to help those who, like me, find themselves adrift between realities." though unlike me, you had a clear point of origin to return to. Will we ever hear from you again? Marco asked. A soft chuckle came through the static. Perhaps. Frequency 99.1 exists wherever realities overlap. Should you ever find yourself in such a liminal space again, you need only tune in. And the displaced? Sophia asked, remembering the fragmented beings that had pursued them. Are they still suffering in that other reality? They exist in all realities simultaneously, yet belong fully to none, Alejandro answered. Their condition is complicated. Some eventually find coherence as I did. Others fragment further until they dissolve into the background noise of existence. It is the risk of traveling between worlds without proper guidance or preparation. The signal was weakening, Alejandro's voice becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish from the static. My connection fades as your reality solidifies around you. Remember what you have learned, that existence is more layered, more permeable than most humans perceive. That what appears solid and singular is often fluid and multiple. We'll remember, Sophia promised, though she wondered if they would, if the extraordinary nature of their experience would gradually fade into the background of normal life, becoming dreamlike and distant with time. Farewell, travelers, Alejandro said, his voice now barely audible beneath the static. May your path remain clear and your reality stable. With that, the radio fell silent. Marco and Sophia stood between the ancient standing stones as darkness settled over Lake Roca, each contemplating what they had experienced and what they had surrendered to return home. Do you think anyone will believe us if we tell them what happened? Sophia asked finally. Marco shook his head. Would you if you hadn't lived through it? No, she admitted. I'd think it was a bizarre dream or hallucination. They began walking away from the standing stones, following the trail that would eventually lead them back to civilization, to Daniel's cabin, to the weekend retreat they had originally planned. Their phones showed the route clearly, technology functioning normally again in this stable reality. What do we tell Daniel about why we're so late? Marco wondered. Sophia, consider this. Car trouble got lost. Both are technically true, just not the whole truth. As they hiked through the gathering darkness, Sophia found herself periodically checking the radio, turning the dial to 99.1 FM. Each time she found only static, no sign of Alejandro's otherworldly broadcast. Yet she kept the device, unwilling to discard this tangible connection to their impossible journey. In the days and weeks that followed, Sophia and Marco attempted to research the standing stones and other potential crossing points between realities. They found little concrete information, mostly folklore and legends about thin places where the veil between worlds was said to be permeable. Nothing that would satisfy scientific scrutiny, yet everything that aligned with their experience. They never told anyone the full story of what had happened. Who would believe them? Instead, they kept the knowledge between themselves, a shared secret that simultaneously bound them closer together and set them slightly apart from everyone else in their lives. Sometimes late at night in remote areas, Sophia would turn on a radio and carefully tune it to 99.1 FM. Usually she found another station, or empty static, but occasionally, very rarely, she would catch a fragment of what sounded like Alejandro's voice, offering guidance to some other displaced traveler finding their way between worlds. And in those moments, Sophia would remember the fundamental truth they had discovered on that impossible journey, that reality was not singular but multiple, not solid, but permeable, not fixed but constantly shifting. That parallel to their ordinary existence lay countless other versions of themselves living slightly different lives based on choices made or unmade, paths taken or avoided. It was both terrifying and strangely comforting, the knowledge that somewhere across the thin boundary between worlds, infinite possibilities existed, and connecting them all, broadcasting across the boundaries of reality itself, was frequency 99.1, guiding lost travelers home. The long way home. You've done this drive 100 times, Liam, Carla Watson insisted. her voice crackling over the car's speakers as I guided my Subaru through the relentless summer rain. The fact that you've gone 2 hours without seeing another vehicle just means you're on the right track. Nobody uses that old mining road except locals. I squinted through the windshield where my wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour. That's exactly my point. I've been on this route dozens of times visiting my parents, and I've never seen it this empty. I didn't add that I'd also never seen it this unsettling, the familiar landscape of the Ozark Mountains, somehow altered as if I were seeing it through someone else's memories rather than my own. Just stick to your GPS, Carla advised. You'll be at your parents' place by dinner time, and we can finally have that conversation we've been postponing. I winced, grateful that she couldn't see my expression over the phone. That conversation, the one where I finally admitted that after 7 years together I wasn't sure I wanted to get married, had been hanging between us for months, growing more unavoidable with each passing day. Yeah, I said non-committally. Look, the reception's getting spotty. I should focus on driving anyway. Fine, she replied, the chill in her voice evident despite the poor connection. Call me when you get there. The call ended, leaving me alone with the rhythmic thump of wipers and the growing certainty that something about this journey was fundamentally wrong. I was taking my usual shortcut, a series of back roads through the Ozarks that shaved nearly an hour off the drive from St. Louis to my parents' home in northern Arkansas. I'd discovered the route during my college years and had used it faithfully ever since, including just 3 months ago during my Christmas visit. But today the road felt different, longer, emptier. The landmarks I'd come to expect, the abandoned gas station at the state line, the distinctive lightning-struck oak near the turnoff to Eden Falls, the small shrine of weathered crosses marking the site of a long-ago accident, were either missing or subtly altered in ways I couldn't quite articulate. I checked my GPS again. GPS. The blue dot indicating my position crawled along the highlighted route, confirming I was exactly where I should be. Yet nothing looked right. Even the quality of light filtering through the rain clouds seemed off, gray or older somehow, as if I were driving through a faded photograph of my usual route rather than the route itself. You're being ridiculous, I muttered to myself. It's the same road. It just looks different in the rain. But it wasn't just the rain. I'd driven this route in all weather at all times of day. This disorientation, this creeping sense that I was simultaneously on the right road and the wrong one, this was new. I was about to pull over to recalibrate my bearings when my GPS chimed with a notification, "Faster route found, rerouting." I frowned. Out here, there shouldn't be any faster alternatives. That was the whole point of my shortcut. It already was the fastest route. Nevertheless, the screen reconfigured, showing a new path that diverged from my planned route at the next intersection, winding through an area of the mountains I'd never explored. That can't be right, I said, slowing as I approached the turnoff. According to the GPS, this new route would save me 45 minutes. Impossible unless there was major construction or an accident ahead on my usual path. The intersection appeared through the curtain of rain, a simple crossing of 2 country roads, unmarked except for a weathered wooden sign that I couldn't read until I was almost upon it, Hollow Creek Ard. I'd never heard of Hollow Creek despite having explored these mountains extensively during visits to my parents. Yet my GPS insisted it was not only a valid route but significantly faster than continuing straight. Logic told me to ignore the suggestion. These back roads could be treacherous, especially in heavy rain. A route I didn't know presented unnecessary risks. But something else, curiosity perhaps, or the strange mood that had settled over me since beginning this drive, compelled me to turn right onto Hollow Creek Road. The moment my wheels left the main route, I felt a subtle but distinct change, like atmospheric pressure dropping before a storm. The road narrowed, hugged closer to the mountainside. The trees, primarily oak and hickory, typical for the Ozarks, seemed to lean inward, creating a natural tunnel that my headlights struggled to penetrate. Despite these slightly ominous characteristics, the road itself was in surprisingly good condition, recently paved with clear markings dividing the lanes. This contradicted my mental image of Ozark back roads, which tended toward the rough and neglected. Whoever maintained Hollow Creek Road considered it important enough to keep in excellent shape. After about 10 minutes, the GPS indicated another turn, this one onto an even smaller road called Echo Path. This name, like Hollow Creek, was unfamiliar to me, though it had a certain poetic quality that appealed to my writer's sensibility. I'd begun my career at a small publishing house in St. Louis, but in recent years had transitioned to writing my own material, primarily horror fiction inspired by Appalachian and Ozark folklore, modestly successful in niche markets. Echo Path lived up to its name. As I navigated its tight curves, I discovered that the sound of my engine bounced back from the rock faces in peculiar ways, sometimes preceding my car, as if another vehicle were just ahead around the bend, other times lingering behind like an auditory shadow. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle, more mist than downpour now. Through it, I began to notice small hand-painted signs posted at irregular intervals along the roadside. Unlike official signage, these appeared to be messages left by locals bearing cryptic warnings or advice. Time runs different here. Adjust accordingly. Don't trust your mirrors. The return journey is never the same length. I might have dismissed these as pranks, local teenagers trying to unnerve outsiders, had they not aligned so perfectly with my earlier sense of disorientation. Something about this route was indeed different, fundamentally wrong in ways I couldn't quite grasp. My GPS now estimated arrival at my parents' house in 90 minutes, significantly shorter than my usual drive time, despite the detour through unfamiliar territory. This made no logical sense unless the entirety of my mental map of the region was flawed. The road descended into a valley I'd never seen before, a narrow depression between steep ridges that shouldn't have existed in my mental topography of the area. At the valley's lowest point, Echo Path intersected with yet another road, this one unpaved, a dirt track that the GPS labeled simply as the long way. And here the GPS did something I'd never witnessed before. It presented me with a choice, displaying a pop-up message that read, 2 routes available. The short way, 2 hours, 17 minutes, or the long way, 5 hours, 43 minutes. Choose your path. In all my years using navigation systems, I'd never seen one offer options in this manner, phrased in such archaic terms. The short way and the long way sounded like something from a fairy tale, not modern GPS terminology. Common sense dictated choosing the shorter route. I was already running late, and my parents would be concerned if I didn't arrive before dark. Yet I found myself hesitating, my writer's curiosity piqued by the strangeness of the situation. What exactly was the long way, and why would anyone choose a route that added over 3 hours to their journey? As I sat at the intersection contemplating my options, I noticed something I'd overlooked: a small, weather-beaten store on the corner, its faded sign identifying it as Crossroads General. A dim light glowed behind its windows, suggesting it was open despite the isolated location and increasingly late hour. Deciding that local knowledge might prove useful, I pulled into the gravel lot and parked beside the only other vehicle, an ancient pickup truck with rust-eaten panels and no license plate. The store itself looked like something preserved from the 1950s, with peeling white paint and an actual screen door that creaked as I pushed it open. A bell jangled overhead as I entered, though no one immediately appeared to greet me. The interior was dimly lit by a few bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling, illuminating shelves stocked with a curious mix of modern conveniences and antiquated products I recognized from my grandparents' era. Mason jars filled with unidentifiable preserves sat alongside contemporary snack foods. A refrigerator hummed in the corner, containing soft drinks in modern packaging next to milk in glass bottles. "Hello," I called, moving further into the store. "Anyone here?" "Just a moment," replied a voice from the back room, an old man's voice, scratchy with age but strong. A few seconds later, a curtain separating the front of the store from what appeared to be a storage area was pushed aside, and the presumed owner emerged. He was ancient 80, at minimum possibly older, with a face mapped by deep wrinkles and eyes that retained a surprising clarity despite his advanced years. He wore overalls over a flannel shirt, an outfit that might have seemed like an Ozark stereotype if he hadn't carried it with such natural dignity. "Don't get many visitors this time of day," the old man remarked, moving behind the counter with surprising agility. "Especially not when the rain comes. You lost son." "Not exactly," I replied. "My GPS suggested a route I'm not familiar with. I was hoping for some local advice before deciding which way to go." The old man's eyes narrowed slightly. "GPS, huh? Fancy electronic maps." He shook his head. "Strange that it brought you here at all. Most of them devices don't even show these roads. That matched my experience. I'd never noticed Hollow Creek Road or Echo Path on any map before today." "Well, mine did. It's given me two options now, something called the short way or the long way. I was wondering if you could tell me about them." The old man studied me with renewed interest, as if I'd said something significant. After a moment, he reached beneath the counter and produced an actual paper map, yellowed with age but meticulously maintained. He spread it on the counter between us. "Here's where we are," he said, pointing to a spot that, according to the map's scale, should have been about 60 miles from my parents' town. "The short way goes through here." His finger traced a route that cut directly through a section of mountains. "It'll get you where you're going quicker, sure enough. Weather's clear that direction, too, from what I hear." "And the long way," I prompted when he fell silent. Something flickered across his weathered features, concern perhaps, or caution. "The long way?" He traced a much more circuitous route on the map, one that looped widely around the same mountains. "It's longer, like the name says. Roads ain't as good. Weather's worse. Most folks these days take the short way." But I sensed an unspoken reservation in his description. The old man met my eyes directly. "But the short way ain't always shorter in the ways that matter." It was exactly the sort of cryptic statement I might have included in one of my stories, local color designed to unsettle both character and reader. Coming from this man in this place, it sent a chill through me despite the store's warmth. "Could you elaborate on that?" I asked. The old man folded the map deliberately, taking his time before responding. "Some shortcuts come with costs you don't see up front," he said finally. "The short way gets you there faster, sure. But folks who take it, well, they say it changes the destination somehow. Like they end up where they were headed, but it ain't quite right. Details are different. People they know act strange, like they're almost but not quite the same people." I would have dismissed this as superstition, the kind of folk belief that made for good fiction, but had no place in reality had I not already experienced that exact sensation. Earlier on my drive, the familiar made unfamiliar reality slightly but perceptibly altered. "And the long way doesn't do this?" I asked. "The long way is just longer," he replied with a shrug that suggested both simplicity and profound meaning. "Takes more time, more effort. But what you find at the end is what you're really looking for." He paused, studying me again. "Of course not everyone knows what they're really looking for, do they?" That statement hit uncomfortably close to home. Wasn't I driving to Arkansas partly to escape making a decision about Carla, about our future? The questions I'd been avoiding seemed suddenly uncomfortably relevant. "How long have these two routes existed?" I asked, changing the subject slightly. The old man's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. "Longer than roads, son. Longer than maps. Some choices just get built into the land after a while." He tapped the counter thoughtfully. "You know, there's a reason your fancy GPS showed you these options when most don't. Means you're at a crossroads in more ways than one." I wanted to dismiss this as the rambling mysticism of an isolated old man. but something in his steady gaze suggested he saw more clearly than I did, that he recognized something in me I wasn't ready to acknowledge myself. "I appreciate the information," I said, reaching for my wallet. "What do I owe you for the advice?" He waved off my attempt to pay. "No charge for directions. But I will tell you this, whichever way you choose, don't try to double back. Once you decide, commit to it fully. These roads don't take kindly to indecision." With that peculiar warning, he disappeared through the curtain into the back room, leaving me alone in the dimly lit store. The encounter had done nothing to simplify my choice. If anything, it had layered the simple navigational decision with metaphorical weight I hadn't asked for. Back in my car, I stared at the GPS, which continued to display the same options: the short way or the long way. The rational part of me insisted that this was simply a technological quirk, that the old man's warnings were nothing but local superstition designed to intrigue outsiders. The shorter route was the obvious choice. Yet as I sat at that literal and figurative crossroads, I found myself thinking not about arrival times, but about Carla, about our relationship, about the pattern of my life. Hadn't I always taken the metaphorical short way chosen, the path of least resistance? Avoided difficult conversations and decisions until they became unavoidable. Perhaps it was this self-reflection. Or perhaps it was some quality of that strange intersection itself, but I found myself selecting the long way on my GPS. The device recalculated, displaying a new route that would indeed add several hours to my journey, likely meaning I wouldn't arrive until well after midnight. As I turned onto the unpaved road, I felt something shift, not physically, but in some less tangible way, as if I'd stepped through an invisible boundary. The rain, which had lightened to a drizzle, suddenly intensified again. The daylight, already dimmed by cloud cover, seemed to recede further, casting the landscape in premature twilight, though it was only mid-afternoon. The long way lived up to its name in every sense. The road wound tortuously through the mountains, sometimes doubling back upon itself, other times proceeding in directions that seemed to defy my mental compass. The GPS continued to function, though its estimated arrival time fluctuated wildly, sometimes suggesting I'd arrive within the hour, other times calculating journeys of 10 hours or more. What remained consistent was the road itself, a narrow dirt path just wide enough for a single vehicle, bordered by dense forest that occasionally gave way to breathtaking vistas of valleys I'd never seen before, couldn't place within my knowledge of Ozark geography. I passed no other cars, no houses, no signs of human habitation, save for the occasional abandoned structure, a collapsing barn, a stone foundation reclaimed by forest, the skeletal remains of what might once have been a fire tower. As true darkness fell, my headlights carved a tunnel through the absolute blackness of the rural night. The rain continued unabated, transforming the dirt road into a treacherous mud track that required all my concentration to navigate. Under normal circumstances, I would have been frustrated, anxious about my delayed arrival and the increasing difficulty of the journey. Instead, I found myself in a peculiar state of calm acceptance, as if the act of choosing the long way had shifted something fundamental in my approach to time and expectation. I drove for what felt like hours, the sameness of the journey inducing a kind of meditative state. The radio picked up no stations, my phone showed no service, and the GPS continued its erratic calculations, the only constant being that I remained on the long way, with no apparent shortcuts or alternatives. It was during this strange suspended period that I began to notice the appearances. At first, I dismissed them as tricks of light and shadow, the way headlights can transform ordinary objects into momentarily fantastical shapes. But as they became more frequent, more distinct, I could no longer attribute them to optical illusion. Figures stood at irregular intervals along the roadside, human shapes visible for only moments before I passed them, or they receded into the darkness. Some appeared to be travelers from different eras, a woman in 19th century dress, A young man in 1970s attire, an elderly person whose clothing I couldn't place in any specific period. Others were less distinct, more suggestion than actual form, like human-shaped absences in the rain. None made any attempt to flag me down or interact with my vehicle. They simply stood watching as I passed their eyes, reflecting my headlights with an unnatural luminosity that reminded me of animals caught in a flashlight beam. I should have been terrified. Under normal circumstances, I would have been. Instead, I felt an odd recognition, as if I understood implicitly what these figures represented, even if I couldn't articulate it. They were other travelers who had chosen the long way, perhaps, or aspects of what I might become depending on the choices ahead. The writer in me wove narratives around them, even as the rational part of my mind continued to search for logical explanations. Around what must have been midnight, though my sense of time had become thoroughly unreliable, I rounded a bend and saw lights ahead, not the isolated glow of another vehicle or rural home, but the clustered illumination of an actual settlement. As I drew closer, a small town materialized from the darkness, a main street lined with buildings that appeared both historic and well-maintained, windows glowing warmly despite the late hour. My GPS, which had been recalculating continuously for hours, suddenly stabilized, announcing, "You have arrived at Waypoint 1 Meridian." I had never heard of a town called Meridian in this part of Arkansas, but its presence was undeniable. As I drove slowly down the main street, I observed a community that seemed both authentic and somehow theatrical, like a movie set that had been lived in for decades. The architectural styles spanned different periods: Victorian storefronts alongside Art Deco municipal buildings and more modern structures, all coexisting in a way that should have seemed discordant, but instead created a strange harmony. More surprising than the town's existence was its activity level at this hour. People walked the sidewalks, patronized what appeared to be a diner gathered in what looked like a small park at the town center. They moved with purpose but without hurry, and while they noted my passing vehicle, none seemed particularly surprised by the appearance of a stranger. The GPS directed me to pull over near the diner, a classic stainless steel and neon establishment called simply the Waypoint. Exhausted, hungry, and thoroughly disoriented, I decided to stop. Whatever Meridian was, it offered a chance to rest and recalibrate before continuing my increasingly surreal journey. The diner's interior matched its exterior 1950s nostalgia, rendered authentic through actual age and use rather than manufactured retro styling. A counter with red vinyl stools faced a kitchen pass-through, while booths lined the windows. About half the seats were occupied, despite the hour, the patrons a mix of ages and apparent backgrounds. Conversation hummed at a comfortable level, creating a sense of normalcy that contrasted sharply with the strangeness of my drive. I took a seat at the counter, and a waitress, middle-aged, with a name tag reading Helen, appeared almost immediately with a menu and coffee. "You look like you've been on the long way," she remarked, pouring the coffee without asking if I wanted it. "First time." I stared at her, startled by the direct reference. "Is it that obvious?" She smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes. "We don't get many unfamiliar faces this time of night, unless they're taking the long way." "Shortway folks bypass Meridian entirely." She set down the coffee pot. "Food's good here. Real food, not the kind that leaves you hungry an hour later. Take your time deciding." As she moved away to check on other customers, I glanced around the diner more carefully. The patrons were diverse in age and style of dress, yet they shared a quality I couldn't immediately identify, a kind of presentness and attention to their immediate surroundings and companions that seemed increasingly rare in the smartphone era. Indeed, I noticed no one was using any kind of electronic device, not even the teenagers seated in a booth near the back. I ordered a simple meal: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, comfort food that arrived quickly and proved to be genuinely delicious, with the kind of depth of flavor that comes from long-established recipes and quality ingredients. As I ate, I found my thoughts clarifying, the surreal quality of my journey settling into something I could almost comprehend, if not entirely explain. "First milestone's always the hardest," said a voice beside me. I turned to find an elderly woman had taken the stool to my right, a tiny figure with silver hair and eyes so deeply lined they almost disappeared when she smiled, which she was doing now. "The way gets easier once you've passed Meridian." "You seem very familiar with it," I replied, unsure how else to respond to this unsolicited observation. "Oh, I've traveled the long way more times than I can count," she said, signaling to Helen for coffee. "Started when I was about your age, when choosing the harder path seemed like failure instead of wisdom." "And now?" "Now I understand that the long way is the only way to get anywhere worth going." She sipped her coffee. "You're worried about being late, I expect. About people waiting for you, growing concerned." She had articulated my underlying anxiety precisely. Despite the strange acceptance that had come over me during the drive, part of me remained practically concerned about my parents waiting up, about missed calls from Carla, about responsibilities ignored while I took this inexplicable detour. "Time works differently on the long way," the woman continued. "You'll find that however long it takes you, you'll arrive exactly when you need to, no sooner, no later." "That's not how time works," I objected, the rational part of my mind reasserting itself. Her laugh was surprisingly youthful. "Isn't it? Haven't you ever noticed how some hours seem to stretch forever while others vanish in a blink? How a weekend with someone you love feels both eternal and instantaneous. Time has never been the rigid thing your clocks pretend it is." I couldn't argue with her subjective description of time's passage, but I remained skeptical about her more literal claims. "So you're saying no matter how long I spend on this road, I'll somehow arrive at my destination on schedule?" "I'm saying," she replied with gentle emphasis, "that you'll arrive when you're ready to arrive, and that will be the right time regardless of what your watch says." She patted my hand. "Finish your meal. Rest a while if you need to. Meridian exists for travelers to catch their breath before the next leg of the journey." Before I could ask any of the dozen questions her statement raised, she had slipped away from the counter, leaving payment for her coffee under the saucer. Through the window I watched her cross the street and enter what appeared to be a small hotel or boarding house, its sign too distant to read in the rain-blurred night. I lingered over my meal, contemplating her words and the situation I found myself in. Whatever rational explanation might exist for this detour, unmarked roads, GPS malfunction, my own exhaustion creating false perceptions, I had undeniably arrived somewhere real. Meridian might not appear on any map I knew, but its diner served actual food, its streets accommodated my physical vehicle, its residents engaged in conversation with me. After paying for my meal with cash as the diner didn't accept cards, I decided to follow the old woman's implicit suggestion and seek proper rest before continuing. The establishment she had entered proved to be a small hotel called the Wayfarer's Rest, its lobby warmly lit and staffed by a young man who seemed entirely unsurprised by my midnight arrival. "Just passing through," he asked as he checked me in, requiring only my name and no form of payment or identification. "Apparently," I replied. "I'm taking the long way." He nodded as if this explained everything. "Room 7 should suit you then." "It's got a good writing desk with a view of the mountains. When the rain clears, that is." I hadn't mentioned being a writer. "How did you know I'd want a desk?" "Just a hunch," he said, handing me an actual key, not a key card but an old-fashioned metal key attached to a wooden fob with the room number burned into it. "Breakfast is served from 5 until 10. No fixed checkout time. Folks on the long way leave when they're ready." Room 7 was simple but comfortable. A double bed with a handmade quilt, a bathroom with fixtures that appeared vintage but functioned perfectly, and as promised, a solid wooden desk positioned before a window that currently showed only darkness and the streaking patterns of rain. The room contained no television, no telephone, no Wi-Fi information, none of the standard features of modern hotel accommodation. I found I didn't miss them. Instead, I was struck by the profound quiet, broken only by the gentle patter of rain and the occasional distant sound of footsteps in the hallway or conversation from the street below. After the intense concentration required by hours of driving on treacherous roads, the stillness was welcome. I showered, changed into the clean clothes from my overnight bag, and on impulse sat at the desk and opened my laptop. To my surprise, it powered on normally despite the lack of obvious internet connectivity. More surprisingly, when I opened a blank document, words began to flow with an ease I hadn't experienced in months. I wrote until dawn, not one of my usual horror stories, but something different, more personal. A narrative that wove together elements of my own life with the strange journey I was undertaking. It was as if the long way had created a corresponding path in my mind, allowing me to access thoughts and feelings that had been present but inaccessible in my normal routine. When I finally slept, it was a deep, dreamless rest that felt like sinking into the earth itself. I woke to sunlight streaming through the window, the rain having cleared sometime during my slumber. The view that had been obscured by darkness and storm now revealed itself. Mountains rising in the near distance, their slopes covered in the vibrant green of spring foliage, valleys carved by rivers that glinted silver in the morning light. It was a landscape both familiar and strange, recognizably the Ozarks, but configured differently than any perspective I'd seen before, as if I were viewing the region from an angle that didn't exist on any conventional map. Breakfast at the hotel's small dining room proved as satisfying as the previous night's dinner, fresh ingredients prepared simply but perfectly served by staff who seemed genuinely interested in their guests' well-being without being intrusive. I lingered over coffee, observing the other diners, many of whom appeared to be travelers like myself. Their conversations hinted at journeys of various types, not all of them purely geographical. When I finally returned to my car, I found it had been washed. The mud of last night's drive completely removed the gas tank, mysteriously full, though I hadn't visited a station since before turning onto the long way. My GPS activated automatically as I started the engine, displaying a route that continued along the same dirt road now labeled clearly as the Long Way Continuation. As I prepared to leave Meridian, I realized I had no idea how long I'd actually spent there. My watch showed the correct progression of hours since my arrival, yet I felt as if I'd experienced several days' worth of rest and reflection compressed into less than 12 hours. The old woman's words about the flexible nature of time on this route seemed less like mysticism, now more like an accurate description of my experience. The road beyond Meridian was physically easier than what had come before, still unpaved, but wider, better maintained, less severely affected by the previous night's rain. The forest seemed less oppressive, allowing broader views of the surrounding landscape, which continued to present aspects of the Ozarks I'd never encountered, despite my familiarity with the region. I passed occasional houses, now small homesteads set back from the road with gardens and outbuildings, suggesting self-sufficient living rather than modern subdivision convenience. Their occupants, visible at times working outside, would often pause to wave as I passed, neither surprised by my presence nor particularly curious about it. The phantom figures I'd glimpsed the previous night were absent in daylight, or perhaps simply less visible against the detailed backdrop of the living landscape. In their place, I occasionally spotted what appeared to be trail markers or small shrines beside the roadstones arranged in meaningful patterns. Trees with symbols carved into their trunks, once a full-size statue so weathered I couldn't identify what it had originally represented. Hours passed in a pleasant haze of driving and observation. I felt no urgency, no anxiety about my delayed arrival. Whatever strange logic governed the long way had permeated my consciousness, replacing my usual time-bound concerns with a more fluid perspective. It was mid-afternoon when my GPS announced another waypoint ahead, approaching halfway house, recommended stop for long-way travelers. Unlike Meridian, Halfway House wasn't a town, but a single large structure situated where the road crested a mountain ridge. It resembled an Adirondack lodge constructed of massive logs with a stone foundation and a sweeping porch that offered panoramic views of the surrounding mountains. Several vehicles were parked in the gravel lot beside it, the first evidence of other drivers I'd seen since beginning the long way. Inside Halfway House proved to be a combination of restaurant, general store, and informal museum. The central space featured a massive stone fireplace surrounded by comfortable seating, while the walls displayed historical photographs and artifacts related to the region. About a dozen other people occupied the space, some dining, others browsing the small selection of merchandise, a few simply resting by the fire. I was examining a wall of photographs images spanning what appeared to be over a century of the building's existence when a voice addressed me. First time seeing the historical collection? I turned to find a man about my own age, dressed casually, but with a name tag identifying him as Marcus Proprietor. First time at Halfway House entirely, I admitted. I didn't know it existed until my GPS directed me here. Marcus nodded, as if this were a common occurrence. The navigation system sent people our way when they're ready to find us. You're taking the long way, I assume. Yes, though I'm still not entirely sure what that means beyond the literal interpretation. He smiled, a warm expression that suggested he'd had this conversation many times before. The long way means different things to different travelers. For some, it's about slowing down enough to see what they've been missing. For others, it's a chance to reconsider a direction they've been taking. For a few, he gestured at a photograph showing the lodge from what appeared to be the 1930s. For a few, it becomes a permanent detour from the life they thought they were supposed to be living. I studied the old image, noticing details I'd missed initially, particularly a man standing on the porch who bore a striking resemblance to Marcus himself, though the photograph predated his birth by decades. Your family has owned this place for generations. In a manner of speaking, he replied cryptically. Time works differently on the long way. Lineage isn't always as straightforward as it seems. Before I could press for clarification, he changed the subject. You should try the stew while you're here. It's particularly good today. The recommendation proved accurate. The stew was exceptional, rich with flavors that spoke of slow cooking and quality ingredients. As I ate at a table near the fireplace, I found myself in conversation with some of the other visitors, all of whom were taking the long way for their own reasons. There was a retired couple who had been traveling the route for what they described as a few years or maybe decades, their conception of time as fluid as everyone else I'd encountered on this journey. A young woman was making the trip for the third time, each passage apparently revealing different aspects of both the road and herself. A middle-aged man claimed to commute via the long way between 2 points that should have been impossibly distant from each other, the road somehow compressing geographical space while expanding temporal experience. None of their stories conformed to rational explanation, yet all were related with the matter-of-fact sincerity of people describing ordinary experience. More striking was the lack of urgency in their narratives. No one seemed concerned about schedules disrupted or obligations ignored during their time on the long way. Like me, they had absorbed the route's peculiar relationship with time, accepting that they would arrive when they needed to arrive. After my meal, I explored the building further, discovering rooms filled with books, quiet spaces for reflection, even what appeared to be artist studios where visitors could engage in creative pursuits during extended stays. In one such room, I found my laptop had been brought in from my car, though I had no memory of this occurring, and set up on a desk overlooking the mountains. Taking this as the sign it clearly was, I sat down and resumed the writing I had begun in Meridian. The words flowed even more freely than before, as if the long way itself were telling its story through me, using my experiences as a framework for a narrative that extended far beyond my individual journey. I wrote for what felt like hours but might have been minutes or days' time, continued to expand and contract, unpredictably measured only by the shifting light outside the windows and my own rhythms of fatigue and renewal. At some point, Marcus brought me food and coffee. Later, someone else provided a blanket when the mountain evening turned cool. I acknowledged these kindnesses without fully breaking concentration, immersed in a creative flow unlike anything I'd experienced before. When I finally stopped writing, night had fallen again. My document had grown to over 100 pages, a substantial portion of what was clearly becoming a novel rather than one of my usual short stories. Reading back through what I'd produced, I found it both intimately familiar and surprisingly foreign, as if I'd channeled a voice similar to, but distinct from my own. The narrative centered on a character named Liam, my own name, though this Liam was navigating metaphorical long ways through his life, choosing difficult honesty over comfortable deception, embracing uncertainty rather than clinging to false security, accepting that meaningful destinations often required circuitous journeys. The parallels to my actual life were obvious, but not simplistic, the fictional Liam making choices I had avoided and avoiding mistakes I had made. As I saved the document and closed my laptop, I became aware of Marcus standing in the doorway, a mug of what proved to be hot chocolate in his hand. "Some writers find their truest voice on the long way," he remarked, offering me the drink. "Something about the journey strips away the convenient fictions we tell ourselves." I accepted the mug gratefully. "How long have I been writing?" "Does it matter?" he countered. "You wrote what needed writing, that's what counts." He nodded toward the window where pre-dawn light was just beginning to soften the absolute darkness. "The next leg of your journey begins soon, the most important one. What makes it more important than what's come before?" Marcus smiled, that cryptic smile again. "Because it's where the long way reveals its true nature, not just as a physical road, but as the path you've been avoiding in your heart. Most travelers find their greatest challenge just beyond halfway house." His words should have sounded pretentious, like something from a self-help book or motivational poster. Instead, they resonated with what I'd been experiencing since first turning onto the long way. The sense that this journey existed simultaneously as physical reality and spiritual metaphor, each dimension equally valid and inextricably linked. When I returned to my car as the sun crested the eastern mountains, I found it once again mysteriously serviced, clean-fueled, ready for the next stage of the journey. The GPS activated with its now familiar directive to continue along the long way, though the estimated arrival time at my ultimate destination had disappeared entirely, replaced by the simple message, "Arrival when ready." The road beyond Halfway House descended from the mountain ridge into a valley I couldn't identify from my knowledge of Ozark geography. Unlike the previous sections of the long way, which had maintained at least a tenuous connection to recognizable reality, this landscape felt fundamentally different, not just unfamiliar, but almost archetypal, as if I were driving through the platonic ideal of a valley rather than any specific physical location. The quality of light, the behavior of shadows, even the way sound traveled through the air all seemed subtly altered, conforming to laws similar to but distinct from those governing the world I knew. Colors were simultaneously more vivid and more harmonious, creating visual compositions that seemed deliberately designed rather than randomly occurring. The overall effect was like moving through a masterfully executed painting that had somehow been given 3 dimensions. I drove for what felt like hours through this transfigured landscape, passing neither settlements nor other vehicles. The dirt road narrowed again, winding alongside a river that appeared on no map, yet felt strangely significant, as if its course represented something beyond mere hydrology. Eventually, the GPS directed me to turn onto an even smaller track that climbed away from the river, ascending toward a gap between 2 rounded peaks. "Approaching final waypoint," it announced. "Preparation recommended before continuing." The waypoint proved to be a small clearing beside a natural spring, its water emerging from a rock face to form a perfectly circular pool before continuing downhill as a narrow stream. A single ancient tree, a species I couldn't identify, spread its branches over the pool, creating a canopy of dappled light and shadow. Stone benches surrounded the spring, worn smooth by what must have been generations of use. There were no buildings, no other vehicles, no obvious signs of human presence save the benches and a small cairn of stones near the pool's edge. Yet the space didn't feel abandoned. Rather, it conveyed a sense of patient waiting, as if it existed specifically for moments of human arrival rather than continuous occupation. I parked and approached the spring, drawn by both the practical need to stretch my legs and a less tangible attraction to the site itself. The water in the pool was incredibly clear, revealing a bottom lined with what appeared to be coins and small objects, offerings left by previous visitors, I assumed. Some looked ancient, others modern, all coexisting in the timeless medium of the water. Beside the pool, I found a metal cup hanging from a branch of the tree. It seemed both an invitation and an instruction. I filled the cup with spring water and drank, finding it cold and sweet with mineral notes that spoke of deep underground sources. The simple act felt ritualistic, significant in ways I couldn't articulate, but nonetheless understood intuitively. As I sat on one of the stone benches, I became aware of a subtle shift in my perception, not a dramatic visionary experience, but a clarifying of mental focus that allowed me to see connections previously obscured. My journey on the long way, my relationship with Carla, my writing career, my sense of self, all appeared as interwoven strands of a single narrative rather than separate aspects of my life. The insight that emerged most clearly was that I had been avoiding genuine commitment in all areas, not just my relationship with Carla. I had taken narrative shortcuts in my writing, settling for effective genre formulas rather than exploring the more challenging territory of authentic emotional truth. I had maintained a comfortable distance from my parents, visiting regularly but never engaging with the deeper currents of our relationship. I had cultivated a self-image as someone perpetually in progress, using the promise of future growth to excuse present limitations. These realizations came without self-judgment or recrimination. The long way seemed to foster clarity without condemnation, understanding without excuse. I saw my patterns with the same objective compassion I might bring to a character in one of my stories, recognizing that fear rather than malice motivated most of my evasions. How long I sat by the spring, I couldn't say. The light remained constant, neither brightening nor dimming, as if this place existed in a perpetual present moment, untethered from the normal progression of hours. I might have remained indefinitely in that state of peaceful self-examination had my GPS not chimed from the car, indicating it was time to continue. The final section of the long way led through the gap between the peaks and began descending toward what I somehow knew was the edge of this altered landscape, the boundary between the long way and conventional reality. The road narrowed to little more than a track, forcing me to navigate with extreme care around tight curves and occasional washouts. Yet despite the physical challenges, I felt a growing sense of completion, of approaching not just a geographical destination, but a resolution to the internal journey that had paralleled my external one. As the road rounded a final bend, I saw it a simple wooden bridge spanning a narrow but deep ravine. Beyond the bridge, the dirt track connected to a paved highway that I recognized immediately, the main route to my parents' town, the very road I would have been on had I not taken the mysterious detour onto Hollow Creek Road. My GPS screen flickered, then displayed a message I hadn't seen before. The long way ends. Choose your destination. Below this cryptic statement were two options. Continue to original destination 5.3 miles, return to starting point 0.2 miles. The choice confused me momentarily. My original destination was clear my parents' home now, apparently just over 5 miles away. But the starting point option made no sense. I was hundreds of miles from where I'd begun my journey in St. Louis, yet the GPS suggested it was almost immediately accessible. As I hesitated at the bridge approach, I noticed something I'd overlooked, a small turnout just before the crossing, where another dirt track branched away from the long way. Following this alternative with my eyes, I could see it looped back, eventually reconnecting with the road I'd just traveled. This apparently was the return to starting point, not St. Louis, but the beginning of the long way itself. The implication was both impossible and, within the logic of this journey, perfectly consistent. I was being offered the choice to complete my original trip or to cycle back through the long way again, perhaps indefinitely. The GPS wasn't merely suggesting navigation options, but presenting a fundamental life decision: move forward with the insights I'd gained or retreat into the comfortable liminality of the endless journey. I thought of the travelers I'd met at Halfway House, some of whom had been on the long way for what they described as years or decades. Had they faced this same choice and decided to loop back? Was the long way a path to transformation for some, but a form of evasion for others, a way of perpetually approaching, but never quite reaching the truth they sought to confront? As I contemplated these questions, my phone, silent since I'd first turned onto Hollow Creek Road, suddenly chimed with incoming messages. Service had apparently been restored now that I'd reached the boundary of conventional reality. I had dozens of missed calls and texts, most from Carla, others from my parents, all expressing increasing concern about my unexplained absence. According to the timestamps, I'd been out of contact for nearly 3 days, far longer than my journey should have taken, yet consistent with my subjective experience of time on the long way. What wasn't clear was how I could explain this absence, or what I would find when I crossed that bridge and returned to normal reality. The old store owner's warning echoed in my memory: once you decide, commit to it fully. These roads don't take kindly to indecision. Whatever choice I made now would be irrevocable. I understood this with absolute certainty, though I couldn't have explained how I knew. In that moment of decision, I thought not of the practical complications awaiting me, but of what the long way had revealed: the patterns I'd been repeating, the growth I'd been avoiding, the connections I'd been keeping safely superficial. I thought of Carla, waiting for an answer I'd been afraid to give, of my writing that could be so much more if I were willing to risk genuine vulnerability, of the conversations with my parents I'd been postponing for years. I started the car and drove forward, crossing the bridge without further hesitation. As my wheels touched the pavement on the other side, I felt a subtle but unmistakable shift, a return to conventional physics, to normal light and sound, to the world I had always known but would never again perceive in quite the same way. My GPS reset itself, displaying the standard navigation interface with my parents' address as the destination 5.3 miles ahead. When I checked the rearview mirror, I saw not the bridge I had just crossed, but a simple country road intersection with no indication of the dirt track I'd been following for what felt like days. The long way had disappeared, or perhaps had never existed in conventional reality, accessible only to those who needed its particular form of journey. The short drive to my parents' home felt surreally ordinary after what I'd experienced. The familiar landmarks were exactly as I remembered them. The town unchanged, my parents' house just as it had always been. When I pulled into their driveway, they came out to greet me with a mixture of relief and confusion that confirmed the objective reality of my prolonged absence. "We were about to file a missing person report," my father said as he helped me with my bag. "3 days without a word, Liam. That's not like you." "I know," I replied, realizing I had no plausible explanation to offer. "I'm sorry for worrying you. There was a detour, a very long detour." My mother studied my face with the perceptiveness that had always seen through my childhood evasions. "You look different," she observed. "Something's changed." "A lot has changed," I acknowledged. "I have some important decisions to make." Inside, after the initial flurry of concern had settled, I called Carla. Our conversation was difficult but honest in a way our communication hadn't been for months. I didn't propose, or break up either would have been another form of shortcut. Instead, I suggested we take time to reassess what we truly wanted, both individually and together, with a commitment to complete honesty regardless of the outcome. In the days that followed, I wrote more than I had in months, continuing the novel I'd begun on the long way, transferring its insights and energy into my regular life. I had deeper conversations with my parents than we'd managed in years, addressing long-standing tensions and unspoken expectations. I began making plans that felt authentic rather than obligatory or safe. A week after my return to conventional reality, I was hiking in the woods near my parents' home when I came across an unmarked dirt road, not the one I'd taken before, but similar in its unassuming appearance and absence from official maps. For a moment I was tempted to follow it, curious whether it might also lead to the long way or some equivalent alternate route. Instead, I marked its location in my memory, but continued on my planned path. The long way had taught me what I needed to learn at that particular juncture. If I needed its wisdom again, I suspected it would find me when the time was right. Some journeys, I had discovered, are meant to be taken exactly once, their value lying not in repetition but in how they transform our experience of the familiar roads we travel every day. The long way continues to exist in the manuscript I'm now completing, in the more authentic relationships I'm building, and in my willingness to choose meaning over convenience, even when the path is neither short nor clearly marked. After all, the truest destinations have always required the longest journeys,